Hello, everyone. Hello. Welcome back to the stream. This is Danny Dhaiphong, and as you can see, I'm joined by a returning guest, regular guest, Brian Berletic of the New Atlas. How are you doing this evening, Brian?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me back.
Of course, of course. So before we get started, everyone, make sure that you're hitting the like button. That helps get viewers into the stream. Of course, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that notification bell. YouTube does maybe the worst that it can to notify you, but there are many other ways to be notified of streams. You can find them all in the links in the description from Substack, Telegram, through my link tree. And of course, please do consider supporting this channel on Patreon, Substack, YouTube, and the one-time options in the links in the description. But let's get started. Okay, so Brian, let's get started with the Prigozhin chaos, so to speak, or at least the chaos that lasted for a day. So you've been following these developments. It was Saturday, I believe. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former leader of the Wagner group, he staged a mutiny, and it was essentially put down in 24 hours. There was negotiations with Lukashenko of Belarus, and now it appears that he's in Belarus. But during this mutiny, which I believe only had a very tiny minority of Wagner's total men, during this time, you had the collective West, you had Ukraine attempting to paint this as a civil war, you had the media do the same thing. All of the anti-Russia folks on social media were saying, this is a civil war, Russia's in real trouble. And now Putin has come out with a series of speeches, but his most latest speech he talks about how much of a betrayal this was and how effective the response to this was. What do you think the impact of this is here from here on out? What will be the aftermath of this? Because there was a lot of heated debate about how Russia handled this and who was actually at fault for this. Was it Prigozhin? Was it the defense ministry, Shoigu and Gerasimov? And there's been a heated debate. So I'm wondering about your take on the situation, and where do you think that this is going to take the Ukraine conflict and Russia as a whole from here?
Well, I think the special military operation is going to continue as planned. I don't think this even remotely disrupted the special military operation. It was a festering problem. A lot of people, and I was on the fence on regarding this. Prigozhin had, very frequently grabbed headlines, was causing problems, was causing disruptions, was challenging the Ministry of Defense, which, he has fashioned himself as some sort of commander of the Wagner private military company. And he was on the battlefield, on the front lines, often very visible. But you can't do that. If you're a commander, you don't challenge the Ministry of Defense. That is insubordination. That's something that you could end up terminated entirely for. So he was a problem, and maybe because if you look at his history, has been involved in the Russian government for so long, he's worked his way up. He's a somewhat prominent figure, at least up until now, and maybe they just said, they understood that it was a problem, but at the time they felt he was doing more good than bad. But this was him crossing the line. We saw him escalating. Each time he would escalate more and more. And I think in his mind, he thought this was a reasonable escalation, although he quite clearly overplayed his hand, crossed too many lines, going to Rostov. They parked some military vehicles outside this headquarters building and then sending a convoy to Moscow. I mean, what can you call that other than mutiny, insurrection, treason, as Russian President Vladimir Putin had said? And the aftermath, clearly, there's no change in the Ministry of Defense. This was Prigozhin's main issue. He wanted a shakeup in the Ministry of Defense. There was none. After Putin finished this, concluded with his speech about Prigozhin's going to Belarus, Wagner's being completely absorbed into the Ministry of Defense. He had a meeting with the Minister of Defense, Shoigu, and all of the top guys were there, and so nothing changed. So Prigozhin got absolutely nothing out of this. He was liquidated administratively. He wasn't liquidated, not yet entirely, but now he's in Belarus. Wagner is firmly under the control of the Ministry of Defense. It's not even Wagner anymore, I don't think, at least not as of right now. So I mean, that's where it is. And what is this show? The Western media is trying to portray this as illustrating the weakness of Russia. But I mean, everybody, when Russian President Vladimir Putin made his speech before noon, the day of this event, this incident, and he called it treason, he was saying to Prigozhin, I'm not siding with you on this, and I'm not tolerating this. This is it. You're done. And everyone in Russia, in the military, in the government, sided with the Russian president. I think the U.S. and the European Union, they would dream of being able to display such unity on any issue, let alone their proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. So I don't think that was a demonstration of weakness. I think it was a demonstration of strength. Now, people are wondering, why didn't the Russian military just flatten Prigozhin and his convoy? And the reason is, if you watch Patrick Lancaster's video, he traveled 10 hours to Rostov to cover it in person. Hats off to him. And he was interviewing people. They love Wagner. They love Prigozhin. They also love the Ministry of Defense. They love the Russian president. They love everybody. They were happy that it was over with relatively little bloodshed. And this was the reason why the Russian government was so reasonable in the response to it. They did not want to escalate. They didn't want to create division. They didn't want to demoralize people by flattening a military force that has been considered heroes by the Russian people. They took Bakhmut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is quite astounding because there was a lot of anger. I mean, not just on social media, but there was, you could tell in terms of the response to those who have been following the special military operation, who support Russia's goals. You could see that there was some confusion and some anger about Prigozhin kind of being let go, so to speak. But at the same time, it might be understandable to feel that way, given that Putin himself said in the speech that Prigozhin's mutiny, the forces behind it, did kill several. We don't know how many, but he said several pilots, fighter pilots. And at the same time, what you're saying, though, is important, because what would it have looked like? In my opinion, I wonder what you think about this. In my opinion, it would have looked incredibly bad for Russia to get into an internal conflict that would have cost the lives of hundreds, if not thousands of people, if there was a direct confrontation between Russia's army, military, air force, and even the minority number of Wagner fighters that Prigozhin had behind him.
Yeah, I think it's important. You've made this point several times. I think it's important for people to understand this was a minority of the Wagner Force. When it was happening, I was looking at the visual evidence, and it looked like maybe 1 or 2 battalions were involved. I've heard numbers as high as between 5, maybe 4 or 5,000 Wagner, but I'm not sure. I mean, I haven't seen a confirmed number of how many actually joined, but there's between 25 and maybe 38,000 Wagner fighters total. So that is a minority. That's very important to understand. And you're absolutely right. You don't want to be fighting, wasting ammunition, losing equipment, losing good men, men maybe roped into this unwittingly. Maybe they didn't really fully understand what they were doing. You don't want to be doing that while you're also fighting the combined power of NATO, because that's what Russia is doing. They're not fighting Ukraine. They're fighting NATO by proxy in Ukraine. So this is something you don't want to do. And a point that I tried to make, a point that on the Duran, Alex and Alexander often make, is that you can't just look at this in terms of military issues. You have to look at it diplomatically, economically, socially, politically. There's so many other dimensions that the Kremlin is looking at when they make decisions, like the speed of the special military operation. A lot of people complain that it's going too slow, but look at all of these other issues. It is not just a matter of military strategy, tactics, strategy, and moving across the battlefield. You also have to think about your allies, your economy, your trade with your allies, people that are on the fence worldwide. How can you win them over? So all of this is put into the equation. And that is something only the Kremlin can do, because they're the ones getting all of the information. Everyone else is just seeing a little slice of it. And another point I want to kind of make about Wagner, especially the maybe some of the fighters who joined Prigozhin on this misadventure, you have to think, when you're on the battlefield, you are just getting a small part of the picture. You might be asked to do things. You might be in a situation that you think is unfair, but the bigger picture, you're playing a crucial part, and the suffering that you're undergoing might actually be absolutely necessary and unavoidable in the grand scheme of things. And this is why militaries throughout human history, it's unquestioning obedience that is required from soldiers, because almost always you're being asked to do things to sacrifice for the greater good. And so I think this was a real problem Prigozhin was having, and this idea infected the minds of the people around him in Wagner.
Mm. Yeah, and that was quite clear for a while, because I remember back around the time where Prigozhin was announcing Bakhmut is about to fall. At the same time he was doing that, this was, I think, around the 1 year around the 1 year anniversary of the conflict. He was saying, he was coming out with a video that was just really disturbing, where he was going to dead bodies and saying, this is your fault, Shoigu, this is your fault. I think he called out Grozmarov too, and said, you're the reasons why this is happening. And it was very insubordinate. It was very problematic because it was a very public statement that did make the rounds. But when it comes to Prigozhin and Wagner, I'm wondering about the reality behind this. Like, you've been following the conflict and what's been transpiring for a while militarily. How would you assess Prigozhin's criticisms? Because obviously his major problem was with Shoigu, was with the Ministry of Defense. What do you think about his criticisms and how Russia is conducting this special military operation?
It's a good question, and it goes back to what does Prigozhin know versus what does the Kremlin know? What can the Kremlin see that Prigozhin cannot see? Obviously, Prigozhin isn't privy to all of the information that he needs to actually know for certain that the Ministry of Defense is running the special military operation poorly. I think that when you look at what's going on and you see in hindsight how everything has played out, I think Russia's approach is very appropriate. And again, I remember following the conflict in Syria from the very beginning, 2011, all the way to Russia's joining of the conflict in 2015 at the invitation of Damascus, and then the whole operation that Russia was conducting in Syria. And I remember the same exact criticisms. It's too slow. You're not being aggressive enough. These people should all die. Turkey should suffer and die in pain for, because they were actually shooting down Russian planes, right, ambushing rescue teams. And there was a lot of people who were livid, and they were condemning Russian President Putin and everybody around him. But as that played out, you see that they played that perfectly. It was strategy. It was giving up your instant gratification, your desire for revenge now for long-term victory, because Russia most certainly won that conflict. They and their Iranian and Syrian allies, they won that conflict by being patient, incrementally achieving their goals, thinking about the long term, thinking about geopolitics as well as the conflict unfolding within and around Syria. And it's the exact same situation for Ukraine. As a matter of fact, it's much more complex. There's much more at stake. And this is why Russia is being careful. So I think Prigozhin was a loose cannon, and they finally tied him down. They're decommissioning him, so to speak.
And it's not a bad situation for him. I mean, Belarus is a beautiful country. He's going to be taken care of. But at the same time, he is accused of treason. And so he kind of, I think he got a pretty lucky break, as well as those who followed him. And to me, it was a genius move by Putin, because you both solidify and legitimize the integrity of what Wagner has done up until this point. And without Wagner, Russia would not be in the battlefield situation that it is in now, which is very favorable. So I think that was very smart to congratulate them, praise them, treat them well because of that, while at the same time being very firm about how this was just unacceptable and it was going to end one way or another. And Putin said himself, they stopped. It was the Wagner fighters themselves. They were not going to take another step into conflict, and we were able to diffuse it because there was an awareness of the consequences. I'm just wondering, though, where do you feel like this conflict changed in the sense that I think in the beginning, right up until the peace negotiations that took place, that Turkey mediated and the UK and the US and Ukraine scuttled, right up until then, it seemed like Russia was like, okay, we can just push and win, and they'll be forced to give up, and we'll come to a pretty good compromise that I think all sides will like. And I think Russia thought they had that, and Putin showed the paper recently to an African Union mission, say, we had this signed, everyone signed it, this peace agreement. And then after that, it seemed like there was a realization that this was going to be a pretty long conflict. what changed? Like, could you remind people? Because I think some of these emotional responses of Russia's got to go harder, smash Wagner, smash Ukraine, and the whole thing kind of gets, I think, a little bit naive when it comes to the realities on the ground. So what changed?
Well, a lot of people are hardliners. People that talk like this, they are hardliners, and they are only thinking about tactics, not even strategy, let alone logistics, which is extremely important. And then beyond that, geopolitics. But you're right that when Russia conceived the special military operation, they did not have just one plan. They had a multitude of contingencies. They wanted to rush in and panic Ukraine into surrendering. They wanted to surround Kiev, pressure Kiev to sign the deal. They also, obviously, and for years ahead of time, prepared for an extremely large, protracted, intense conflict. They obviously have the amounts of equipment and ammunition and also the industrial capacity to sustain the use of such a large force in such intense combat. So that they already knew that there was a good possibility, almost a certainty, that this was going to end up being a long war. They attempted these other contingencies in an attempt to shorten it if possible. If you could have, panicked Ukraine into surrendering in the first week, you would have avoided all of these tens of thousands of deaths, injuries, the destruction of Ukraine, its infrastructure, its economy. You would have avoided all of that. So if there was even a small possibility of achieving that quickly and with little cost, why not give it a try? But at the same time, you've also for years prepared your military for a much larger and protracted conflict. And I believe that Russia has actually not only prepared for a protracted conflict as we see playing out, but they're also thinking about NATO intervention. Ultimately, that this is what they have in mind, and this is what they're thinking about. This is another reason why they're conducting the special military operation the way that they are. They're not going to, people want to see these big arrow offensives by Russia. Well, if they do that, they're going to have the same bad luck that Ukraine is having. You can't just drive tanks in a big arrow offensive through a minefield. You're going to take huge losses doing that. Even if you provide air cover, artillery cover, and you try to demine and clear paths for your tanks, you're going to take a lot of losses. It's impossible not to take those losses. If they went ahead and did that to defeat the Ukrainian military right now, and then NATO intervened, then what? So people have to think this is like a chess game. When you play chess, you don't just look at the board as it is right now. You need to think several steps ahead, and several steps ahead for a multitude of scenarios. This is like, it's a lot when you're a chess game is complicated enough, but this is the real world. This is geopolitics. This is on a global scale. So this is what the Kremlin is looking at. This is what's driving their decision making. They don't care about short-term gratifying victories on the battlefield. They care about long-term victory.
Yeah. I mean, it makes perfect sense, given that NATO itself has shown that that's what it wants. And so if it's been, I know you've covered this, maybe you can explain just how NATO has approached this conflict. It feels like that's what NATO has done. They've watched Ukraine go through one army after another, then they replenish the army, but not to the degree, and some of this has to do with NATO's own capabilities or lack thereof. But at the same time, NATO, where regardless of the reasons, it seems like NATO has concluded that, this is a long war itself, regardless of the various contradictory messages that comes out of various leaders within NATO, especially the U.S. side usually, and Ukraine as well, outside of NATO, you saying many different kinds of things, really confident and going back. But it seems like the conclusion is the same, that this is going to be a grind, and that's what it's been so far. So what have you thought about NATO's approach to the conflict that can help us understand why Russia isn't necessarily, and the Ministry of Defense isn't necessarily keen on following someone like Prigozhin, so it's following those methods and tactics.
But NATO was encircling and containing both Russia and China, and they do it through a variety of ways. And most of their focus is, okay, yes, building up military capabilities, building up proxies like Ukraine militarily, but a lot of it is political games, the information warfare. The West's military capabilities have degraded over the last couple of decades. They've degraded and they have transformed into a force for fighting the small wars that the West has been fighting for the last 2 decades plus. And it's very, very difficult to switch from doing that to the type of footing that, say, Russia has and has had all along. I mean, Russia and the Soviet Union before the Russian Federation focused on massive land armies, air power, nuclear deterrent, but mainly huge amounts of tanks, artillery, and an industrial capacity to sustain the operation of these forces in an intense, large conflict. The West does not have these capabilities. Clearly, they do not. So, honestly, I don't know what NATO is thinking. I don't know what Washington is thinking. They have these ambitions, but they do not have the ability to achieve them. And we see that playing out. You said they're going through one army after the other. Think about this offensive force that they created for Ukraine and look at the defenses that they're trying to breach. This is not a surprise. They're acting as if, oh, we're so surprised that Russia's defenses are so formidable. But I've read from the New York Times many, many times, over and over again, that article from December of last year about how massive the defenses were back then in December of last year. Layered defenses, minefields, dragon's teeth, tank traps of all kinds, and the positions they were creating for anti-tank weapons, their own tanks, their own artillery, everything that they were preparing over half a year ago. They did not create a force that is capable of effectively breaching those defenses and succeeding in their offensive. They didn't. But they sent all of this equipment and they encouraged Ukraine to do it anyway. So what are they thinking? I don't know. It's the same as what the U.S. has done in the Middle East or in Central Asia, in Afghanistan. They have been there for the last 2 decades in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Well, they're out of Afghanistan now. They invested so much in that. They were attempting to manipulate and control the entire region, and now they're being pushed out of it. So it just seems as if, again, they have these ambitions that their abilities prevent them from achieving, and yet they cannot think of some alternative view of the world and a way to organize their nation, their people, their resources to do something constructive. Instead, they're pursuing this dead-end foreign policy.
Yes, indeed. Well, let's get into where this offensive is now. Then, what is the latest on the battlefield with Ukraine's offensive? Right before the Prigozhin chaos, I mean, Russia seemed to be in the driver's seat, and as you said, the Western mainstream media has been talking a lot about the surprise of Russia's strength in its defenses. So where are things at? Where are they going with this offensive?
Again, it's important to remind people that Russia has layered defenses. They're layered specifically so that Russia can give ground to Ukrainian attacks as they intensify, as Russia's mobile defense rate in the security zone, as that diminishes, they're able to pull back to these defensive lines and continue to absorb Ukraine's offensive potential, all of these trained men and all of their equipment. So where they are right now is they're still working through the security zone. They're not even up to the main defense lines. There's multiple defense lines from where Ukraine is trying to reach now all the way to Crimea, and in the Donbas region from Bakhmut all the way to Popasnaya. And I we've talked about this, Danny, you and me, many times. We've talked about how Russia, maybe they'll give up a whole bunch of territory to Ukraine. It doesn't matter, because once the offensive is over, no matter where it ends on the map, Ukraine does not have the ability to sustain anything beyond that. They have no ability to hold the territory that they take. And NATO now, this round, they don't have another army to give Ukraine. So they are really reaching the ultimate limit of what they're able to do in this proxy war without NATO intervening themselves directly. And even that is compromised by the fact that they've depleted their stockpiles, their land forces, transferring it all over to Ukraine for the last year plus now.
And supposedly there's a war with China to prepare for. But before we talk about something like that, Alexei Reznikov, Ukraine's defense minister, he seems to not agree with you, Brian. He said he claimed when asked by the media, he said this was the Financial Times. He said that right now Ukraine's offensive is not the main event and just a preview. And when the major push happens, you will all see it. Everyone will see everything. So again, there seems to be this confidence, and I'm wondering, is there a reason to be confident? Is this real? Is this like selling wolf tickets here? Like what's going on? Because, and this has been a pattern with Ukraine's leadership. Zelensky and among others have throughout this conflict, when things are not going so well, they kind of put on this face that they have something else in store. But arguably, we haven't seen serious Ukrainian advances for 10 months now.
Absolutely. Well, in a way, he's right. There still is quite a bit of offensive potential left in this specific force that Ukraine created for this particular offensive. So he's not entirely wrong about that, but he's acting as if, well, we have all of these brigades with Western tanks that we haven't used. It doesn't really seem that way. It seems like they have been using that equipment and they've been losing that equipment. But as I said, they're trying to get through the security zone. And I think eventually they will get through the security zone. If they don't get through the security zone, then they're actually much weaker than I think anyone anticipated. I think even Russia expects them to get through the security zone and at least several layers of the defenses. And again, in Bakhmut, no sooner did Russia secure Bakhmut, the offensive began. So did they have time? And I've talked about this. Did they have time to properly secure Bakhmut against a major offensive? If Ukraine is staging part of that offensive force there for Bakhmut specifically, that would be a huge PR victory for Ukraine. But again, in terms of the actual conflict, they're squandering their forces that they're not going to be able to replace. They could potentially take Bakhmut back. People should be prepared for that. They should be prepared for a breakthrough in the south. The point is, east of Bakhmut are kilometers and kilometers of layered Russian defenses that they have prepared for over half a year, which is entirely unlike the front that Ukraine is pushing along right now in the Donbas region. So this is the problem. They might make some advances and they might say, yes, that is the actual offensive, and they'll get away with it in the information space amongst Western audiences. You saw, I think everyone was seeing the reaction of the pro-NATO, pro-Ukrainian crowd regarding Prigozhin. They were talking about civil war, and you saw how detached from reality their reaction was. And it'll be just the same if Ukraine breaks through the security zone and actually makes it to any of these defense lines, or even passes some of these defense lines. So that's what he's talking about, and he's not entirely incorrect. But again, at the end of the day, what is he hoping to achieve? Does he actually think that this offensive is going to push Russian forces entirely out of what Ukraine claims is their territory? No, it's not going to. And even if it somehow did, they're not going to have an army left. Russia will.
The United States, during the whole Prigozhin chaos, was holding off on actually re-sanctioning, updating the sanctions on Wagner, almost with the belief that somehow Wagner itself had become some kind of useful instrument for them. But in any event, at the same time, we've seen NATO, the NATO Secretary General, Mr. Jens Stoltenberg, everyone's favorite punching bag, he came out and said that Russia should not be underestimated. But I always take these comments with a grain of salt because on the one hand, you've heard NATO and the West, collective West talk about, oh, well, Russia's capabilities are maybe are stronger than we think. But sometimes I think that that's really just a way. It might be true. I think it's true. But at the same time, it might be a way to just prolong the conflict and their role in it. Because usually it's coupled with, well, this is why we need to be more and more involved, because the only way Ukraine will win this conflict is on the battlefield. So your reaction?
Okay, that's kind of a 2-point question about the U.S. role in Prigozhin, the Wagner incident. On one hand, they said they weren't involved, which, I mean, when has the U.S. never been involved in something like this? And leading up to this is all the U.S. and Europe have talked about: disintegrating Russia, dividing and destroying Russia. They have entire papers published about this. And very recently, they've been talking about decolonizing Russia, which means balkanizing it, essentially. So this was their dream scenario. It's hard to believe that they had no role in this at all. They claim that they didn't want to get involved. They were worried. They were concerned. They were calling up Russia in the middle of it because they didn't want to see instability in Russia. They were worried about the nuclear arsenal falling into the wrong hands, something to this effect. But at the same time, they claimed that they had intel weeks ahead of time about this pending coup that Prigozhin was plotting, but they didn't tell Russia. So which is it? It doesn't, nothing they say adds up. The only thing we can be sure of is that the U.S. isn't telling us the truth. But what their role was in this, I have not seen evidence to prove one way or the other. So I think we should keep our minds open to that possibility, but I don't think we should draw any conclusions because we just don't know. Now you're talking about the collective West, the Western media, talking about how formidable Russia apparently is suddenly after, they didn't have shoes, they were freezing in their trenches,
fighting with toilet seats or something like that, weren't they?
Yeah, and shovels.
Shovels,
shovels. They took over Bakhmut using shovels. So now suddenly they're saying this. And it's interesting that you say that might be because NATO is trying to prepare the public for its intervention. We've actually seen articles where they're talking about the Ukrainian Air Force and how they're helpless right now with what they've been given from NATO, Soviet-era warplanes. And even if you transfer F-16s to them, they will still be helpless. The only way to help Ukraine in its offensive and onward is for NATO to intervene with its air power, use its air power to support Ukrainian troops. Kind of like what they did in Libya. They didn't go in on the ground, but NATO used its air force to change the tide, basically, for that conflict, and they ultimately destroyed Libya. So maybe they're thinking of something along the lines of that regarding Ukraine. Think about it. If they're flying out of NATO territory, they're striking targets in Ukraine, they're going back to NATO territory, their bet is going to be that Russia wouldn't dare strike their airfields in NATO territory. They would try to avoid escalating. They're probably right about that, but I wouldn't want to be the person to make that decision. On the other hand, though, Russia does have air-to-air capabilities. They also have the best air defenses in the world. So NATO is not going to be doing this like they did in Libya, just bombing from 10,000 feet up, no consequences. They're going to lose warplanes. They're going to lose a lot of warplanes, just like Ukraine lost all of their warplanes. That is what's going to happen. So it's going to be a bloody nose for NATO, even if they do help level the playing field a little bit. And just remember, as you hinted at, we'll talk about the U.S. war they're trying to provoke with China. They're going to need that air power for China. That is how they're mainly going to be fighting China: air power, naval power. Yep. And they're going to have to make a decision. Do we commit this to Ukraine, or do we commit this to the Pacific? Because we really can't do both. I don't see how they can do both.
Yeah, and the scenario you described, I mean, do you feel like this is where it's going after this offensive? Because as you mentioned, once the offensive is over, no matter what happens, even if they break the defense lines, they end up meeting the Russian military, further east. There will be consequences in the sense that now NATO has to make a decision because Russia will decimate the latest army, and there may not be much left to provide Ukraine to continue it by proxy. So do you feel like NATO will, I mean, to imagine a Libya scenario in Ukraine seems almost just unimaginable, because it means that they're kicking the ball in Russia's court and saying, what are you going to do? And obviously Russia's going to shoot down the planes. And then what will the US? It seems like that could cascade into something incredibly dangerous globally in terms of a nuclear situation, because I don't think Russia will want to fight a direct war with NATO and lose all, that's not going to happen. And I don't think NATO would want that to happen either. So where would that go if it gets? Do you feel like it's getting to that point?
Well, I do, and I have been worried about this since the special military operation began in February 2022. I always said from the very beginning that the U.S., its allies, they will be tempted to, at a minimum, create some sort of buffer zone in Western Ukraine and expand hostilities from there, depending on what opportunities they think they can exploit by doing so. We've seen them do the exact same thing in Syria. That's what they are doing. They're still in Syria, but that was a losing proposition. And that was a scenario where you had Western warplanes in the sky, you had Russian warplanes in the sky, ground forces on the ground together. Sometimes there were incidents. I got very close to escalating or spiraling out of control, but there was the management of escalation, and it prevented, even though the U.S. was losing, they still realized that things really weren't in their favor. Russia really did dominate the means of escalating onward as the conflict devolved into a larger and larger fight. And I think the same scenario is probably going to play out in Ukraine. Think about it. Ukraine has been a part of Russia throughout history. This is practically a civil war in many ways. And Russia is right there on the border of what remains of Ukraine. And the United States is going to have to, they're going to be providing the bulk of the equipment, ammunition. If it gets to that, the fighters, the actual soldiers and airmen are going to be American. They're going to have to cross the Atlantic to get there, cross Europe to get to the battlefield, because none of the nations in Europe are going to be capable of fighting Russia, not by themselves, even collectively. We could even just look at the inventories of, say, France or the UK or Germany. What do they have left in their armies in terms of artillery or tanks? What type of air forces do they have? Do you think that their air force would be a bigger threat to Russia than Ukraine's? But I think Russia would be able to manage it. So it will be tempting for them, because I think it's the best chance that they have, and I think they are that desperate to explore that possibility.
Well, perhaps we can close our discussion about Ukraine on this note. I wanted to ask you about, you may or may not have been following, during this offensive, there's been an interesting conversation among Russian academics, and the most, I think, highlighted has been Sergei Karaganov, and he has come out with a series of articles. There have been rebuttals. You can catch it on actually RT. But his initial article argued that Russia should preemptively strike Western Europe with nuclear weapons. And his argument was, no, I am not for the use of nuclear weapons. I do not want to necessarily do so. But he was saying that practically, strategically, everything that this Ukraine conflict has taught us is that Western Europe itself are really the primary backers of this conflict. They are the ones providing most of the assistance, and the whole collective West, he argues, has gotten too comfortable. Like they they truly don't understand the nuclear risk. So Russia should call the bluff and say, actually, there is one. And so he's went over some scenarios, maybe call off Russian nationals who may be living elsewhere, especially in Western Europe, call them back and say it's because there might be a preemptive nuclear strike, and that might, play at the rationality of Western leaders. But there has been a debate. Other Russian academics have said, you might be trusting the collective West too much to be rational actors, and that might not be the best move. What is your take? What do you think about this idea? Because as you said, there have been hardline conversations, discussions happening, given the Prigozhin incident, given how long this conflict has gone. There obviously have been people who have been pretty hardline in Russia and outside of Russia saying, what is Russia waiting for? What's your opinion on this, especially with this nuclear question? Because we just mentioned that's a huge concern given the shape of this conflict and where it's already heading.
Again, the West is not acting rational. The West wouldn't be in the situation that they're in if they were acting rational. A rational circle of power, say in the US or Europe or combined, they would look at the world as it is right now. They would realize that it's changing and they would adapt to it. But what they're trying to do instead is fight against reality. They're fighting against a power, a force of change that is far larger than they are. They have no chance of resisting, and yet they're doing it anyway. This is not rational. The idea that they can contain and divide up and destroy and subjugate both Russia and China is madness. They're not thinking straight. They are not being rational. And when you listen to these people talk, and there is no secret smoky room around a table where they're all conspiring. They do this on YouTube, the Atlantic Council, Brookings Institution. They have their own YouTube channels, and they just openly talk about these things. And when you listen to them, you can hear how utterly detached from reality they are. This is a whole generation of politicians, military leaders, people involved in the economy that did not necessarily earn their positions where they are right now. They do not understand how reality actually works. They don't understand, evidently, they don't understand that if you want to wage a war against Russia and you want to continue this proxy war, you need to build factories that make the ammunition. You can't just say, we're just going to throw money at it and it'll fix it. You have to actually understand what happens with that money. How long does it take? How sustainable is this? How plausible is this? And they would realize that it isn't, and they would stop, but they're not stopping. So the whole, this is what Russia has been doing. This is what China is doing. They're trying to deter the West against their worst impulses, but it isn't seemingly working because they're not thinking rationally. The nuclear issue, Russia carrying out a first strike, that would be disastrous. And I really hope that does. I hope no nuclear weapons are used anywhere on anyone. That would be a complete disaster because everyone has enough nukes to wipe each other out. So nobody's going to win that. But there are other things Russia can do. There's other things China can do and are doing right now to create the conditions on the ground that just make this impossible. This is exactly what they did in Syria. They created the conditions on the ground that simply made the West's proxy war against Syria impossible. And it burned out, and now it's kind of frozen. But that's a lot better than Syria's fate hanging by a thread like it had been for several years. And I think they're doing the exact same thing right now regarding Ukraine. They're trying to create and demonstrate reasons why the West should not escalate further and the consequences for it. And I think they have a lot of ways of asymmetrically responding that will confound the U.S. and its allies if they decide to escalate further.
Oh, agreed. And I definitely want your thoughts on how I thought about this debate, and especially Karaginov's position. Is I understand having nuclear weapons and kind of reminding the collective. I get there might be a point where the collective West has to be reminded, look, this could end up in complete and utter disaster. However, given just what I've witnessed in recent history with U.S. leadership in particular, I do think it would be a grave miscalculation to believe that U.S. leadership, especially in foreign policy, are rational enough, believe in the self-preservation of their system enough to not do something incredibly rash if there was a preemptive strike by Russia. The United States, I don't think, can be trusted by any measure on what its response would be. And I think that's why it has been so smart for Russia to take the path that it has taken. Russia obviously has wanted to preserve its own military, its own forces, not, you've talked about it a lot, doesn't want a lot of casualties. It wants to protect people, honestly. It wants to protect its military. It wants to protect its forces. But at the same time, I also think there's another element. It also does not want a direct confrontation with NATO. I don't think it's necessarily scared of it, but I think Russia's pretty knowledgeable about what the consequences would be. And Russia would seemingly know best, given that NATO has formed a ring around it. So you don't really need much of a telescope to even understand, to see what is happening before its eyes. But what are your thoughts about that? That's my take. I don't want nuclear strikes either. I get if you need to remind, hey, this is the possibility. There could be very political moves you could take to remind, but at the same time, to actually conduct it would probably be a mistake, especially at this stage of the conflict, where Russia has seemingly done very well in this long war and is not on the verge of collapse. And there's no reason for desperation, it seems. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I don't think, again, people talking about using nuclear weapons, I don't think they're zooming out and looking at the big picture entirely, because there's so many other things that Russia can and is doing right now. There's economic options. I'm pretty sure they're still sending gas through Ukraine, and even paying Ukraine for that gas is continuously flowing. They can shut off Europe completely, because they're not 100% off of Russian energy. And look at the consequences so far of them minimizing it as much as they can, or as much as they can bear. So there's those options, and there's military options. They have their forces. They've demonstrated they're not running out of missiles, and they can use these missiles anywhere. I think, if anything, there would be missile strikes beyond Ukraine's borders long before there would be any use of nuclear weapons. That would just be way outside of what Russia has ever done, or the way Russia thinks, and the way Russia has been organizing its foreign policy. But maybe, the whole point is they're having the conversation to remind the West that they have nuclear weapons. Maybe that's the purpose of this. But again, if people are irrational, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't even matter if you do launch a nuclear weapon into Europe. They're still not going to get it. They're still going. Look at the damage that has already been done to the West. Self-inflicted, and yet they continue. So I have no hopes of convincing them in that way. I think you will convince them when physically they're unable to continue their proxy war, just like in Syria.
Yeah, and to show the world that I think it would underestimate, on the Russian side, it would underestimate the seriousness of especially U.S. foreign policy leadership in waging war on Russia. I think that's not something to underestimate, given, Russia's own history during the Cold War. We may be in a new Cold War, but there were many times where military conflict was very close. So to underestimate that would probably be a mistake too. But I know you wanted to speak about China, and I do too, because you're right. We were talking before this, and you were saying that this Prigozhin incident, but even just the offensive in Ukraine, has taken a bit away from what's been going on between the U.S. and China. And so Blinken visited last few weeks, and it seems like unraveled everything after Biden made some colorful comments about Xi Jinping being a dictator. Now Janet Yellen is supposedly going to visit China in July. China is very suspicious that this is literally all about just U.S. interests, economic interests. The U.S. economy is not doing so hot, and there's a whole debt crisis, and so where are things right now, given the Blinken visit was supposedly going to be this watershed moment in stabilizing relations? It doesn't seem like that occurred at all, and then following it, it seems like there was a lot of unraveling. What's your take?
There's a reason we always eventually talk about China after talking about the NATO proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, because the U.S., NATO, Europe, this is their whole plan, is to encircle and contain Russia and China. And this isn't a recent plan that they've developed. These aren't recent foreign policy objectives that they've been pursuing, even in the last 2 decades even. This stretches all the way back to the end of World War II. I've shown people many times on the U.S. State Department's official website, the Office of the Historian, they have documents talking about how they're going to encircle and contain China, that they were in Vietnam fighting the war against the Vietnamese people because it was part of encircling and containing China. They wanted to use Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, India, and Pakistan to encircle and contain China. And it is a policy that, if you really objectively look at it from that point, the 1950s up until now, has continued uninterrupted regardless of who is in the White House. So U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken traveling to Beijing to smooth things over, that was never the intention. That's what they wanted it to look like, but that is not their intention. And we know this because the U.S. has a pattern of doing this. They have a pattern of attempting to portray themselves before the world as the reasonable one, the peacemaker, and whoever it is that they're pretending to try to make peace with, they're the belligerent one. They're the dictatorship, which is exactly why President Biden called Xi Jinping a dictator, and why Antony Blinken doubled down on that. Think about who the audience is. It's not us. We're not the audience. The audience is the American people who are being propagandized right now to hate both Russians and Chinese, to look under their bed for Chinese, look in their closet for Russians. This is their audience. And in their mind, half of the U.S. population thinks President Biden is an agent of the Chinese government, and the other half think that China is actually a dictatorship, has all these human rights abuses, and Taiwan is a poor innocent country that the U.S. should defend, which is all fantasy. But this is what the American people have been convinced on both sides, left and right. So that was the purpose of Blinken going to Beijing, to make it look as if the U.S. is the one trying to make peace, and it's China that's determined to be belligerent, to create conflict. And the U.S., after exhausting its diplomatic options, they're going to have to resort to sanctions and military options, which are already in play and have been years in the making. They're organizing it right now. I'm going to be doing a video soon about both the Council on Foreign Relations and the Atlantic Council, both of them just this month, releasing reports on. The Atlantic Council one is called Sanctioning China in a Taiwan Crisis, Sanctions and Risk. And what is their model? What is their guiding light? It's their sanctions against Russia and how everything is played out in Ukraine. And Council on Foreign Relations, U.S.-Taiwan relations in a new era, responding to a more assertive China. And when you listen to them talk, because you can go find the corresponding videos on YouTube where they have a panel and they talk about these reports, all they talk about is the need to convince the public that these sanctions are going to be painful. That is the reality. But to convince the West that it's necessary and that it's worth enduring the pain. And look at the pain that Europe is enduring right now for the proxy war against Russia. So this is what I'm trying to get across to people. President Biden, his administration, they're not trying to make peace with China. That is not even an option in their head. It's out of the question. When they pretend that that's what they're doing, this is the reason why. It's to portray. And one more thing, I'm kind of rambling on, but this is exactly what they did for Russia. Remember the reset? Hillary Clinton handing the reset button, a literal reset button to the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And as she was doing that, they were engineering the overthrow of the Ukrainian government to create a hostile, Nazi-infested client regime right on Russia's border. That was the so-called reset. And remember, for Iran, it was the US-Iran nuclear deal, which before it was even proposed publicly, the Brookings Institution in a 2009 report, which passed to Persia, they explicitly said, let's make a deal, offer it to Iran, tell the world that they ruined it, we'll sabotage it, but we'll blame it on Iran. And then we could tell the whole world we tried diplomacy, it didn't work, so now we need sanctions and military options. This is the exact same thing they're doing to China right now.
Well, you mentioned the reset button. I pulled up the video. We have to play it because it is very it is clownish. It is. But
what year was that? Do you remember? Does it say what year that was?
It looks like 2009. It says yeah, this must have been 2000.
Okay. Yeah, so they already
this was 2000. No, this was 2009, I think. March 7, 2009.
Okay.
It might have been right as, like one of Obama's diplomatic moves, but nonetheless, they were preparing. This comes after I don't think the Obama administration, when it came in, denounced what happened right before the Bush administration left, which was basically indicate that Ukraine would be part of NATO eventually. I mean, that's it. And I believe there was color revolution activity in Ukraine right around this time as well. But let's play this because it is hilarious. The gift that keeps on giving, which is Hillary Clinton. Let's play it.
In anticipation of this important meeting and our time here together, I wanted to present you with a little gift which represents what President Obama and Vice President Biden and I have been saying. And that is, we want to reset our relationship. And
let's do it together.
So we will do it together, okay?
So there you go. She hands him a reset button and says, that's what we want to do. We want to reset. Wow, how far things have come. I mean, Hillary Clinton ended up being an architect of the coup in Ukraine 2014. And then Biden, Vice President Biden at the time, look at him being the architect of the conflict, essentially, that NATO is waging. So anyway, continue, because this does show the duplicity and the just outright dishonesty. You can't believe anything that the United States says, because look at what's going on with China. Blinken goes. Now it's getting to the point where it's not even 24 hours after they say something where the complete reverse happens.
And that was 2009. And at that time, because my coverage of the so-called Arab Spring, the U.S. engineered Arab Spring, this regime change campaign that swept North Africa to the Middle East, she was directly involved in preparing the agitators at that time, several years ahead of the 2011 Arab Spring, bringing them to New York, bringing them to other capitals in the West, training them. She would Skype in and talk to them. It was a yearly event, at least one yearly event, where they were doing this and then sending them back to prepare to overthrow their respective countries in 2011. So that was the plan. Think about what the plan was. Why? They eliminated Libya. That was an ally of Russia. Russia was deeply invested in Libya. And that was the beginning of the proxy war in Syria, which, Russia has a base there, and eventually they got dragged into that. That's what they were planning while they were handing this reset button to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. That's what they were doing. And at the same time, like you said, they had been meddling in Ukraine, and they were still meddling in Ukraine, and they still prepared to overthrow the government there and turn it into a militarized, Nazi-infested client regime right on Russia's border. What was that? It was 2008. The whole process in Georgia had already run its course, from regime change to pumping it full of weapons and NATO training, and then the client regime attacking Russian forces in 2008. This is a year later, and they're like, oh, yeah, we're sorry, we won't do that again, while they were planning the next round of provocations and proxy wars. And they're doing the exact same thing to China. I'm here in Southeast Asia. I'm watching the U.S. try to divide and destroy all of Southeast Asia to disrupt their constructive relationship with China, and then have China surrounded either by obedient U.S. proxy regimes or just failed states or destabilized nations incapable of reaching their full potential and helping China and thus the whole region rise together. I'm watching them do that as Secretary of State Antony Blinken pretends to try to reset relations or smooth over relations in Beijing. That was never a thought that was in any of their heads. It was all a deception, and it's this pattern of trying to portray the U.S. as the rational one, the peacemaker, the innocent victim in all of this, who then has to reluctantly apply sanctions and then go to war with these countries because they left them no choice. That's what this is. It's a pattern that they have repeated over and over again, and that they're in the middle of once again with China.
Yeah, and when Antony Blinken was visiting, I mean, he first there was all this impression going around social media saying, "Oh, Blinken's being treated not so well, not getting the red carpet treatment." I mean, he was basically treated how anyone else would have been treated, and it was quite good. And he got to meet with, I mean, they didn't have to do this, but he met with Xi Jinping at the end. He met with Qin Gang, Wang Yi. I mean, these are the senior top diplomats, top leaders in China. But at the end of it, I think he thought that just saying, "Oh, we'll uphold the consensus in Bali at the G20 summit," where Biden and Xi Jinping met on the sidelines and agreed to continue to work through issues. But at the same time, now you have Janet Yellen coming, and similarly, there is such a, I think, superficial and very shallow approach here, where it's like you have mounting aggressive posture and policy against China, where, I mean, just from Janet Yellen's concern, economically, you have the trade war, which predates the Biden administration. No progress on the trade war. You have these sanctions that have kept escalating against China, whether it's through these human rights so-called sanctions that target economic institutions, target economic sectors like China's renewable energy sector. And now you have this export ban on China's semiconductor industry. So technology to China's semiconductor industry is being cut off. The U.S. is trying to pressure countries cut it off. And now you have this looming investment ban that is coming, and it's a Biden executive order where certain sectors of the Chinese economy, certain companies, certain sectors will be banned from investment in, meaning that U.S. companies and potentially even other Western companies, depending on how far the U.S. takes this, will have to think twice before they even conduct any kind of economic relationship. That's a huge escalation. I mean, that is the sanctions escalation ladder. And we're not even talking about the military situation, which literally China said right after the meeting, there has been no reduction in military tensions. Like, there's still ships sailing through the Taiwan Strait. There's still South China Sea tensions. So anyway, your reaction to this part of it, because this doesn't feel like diplomacy at all. This just feels like running interference.
No, it's not. It's what it is the United States trying to give China another chance to think everything over, the deal that they can't refuse. And the deal is, you will subordinate yourself to us, or we're going to just continue doing what we're doing with the military, the economy, and everything. And all they talk about in these panel discussions at the Atlantic Council, the Council on Foreign Relations, this is where U.S. foreign policy is actually created. This is where they reach consensus. They write these policy papers. They have teams of lawyers come in, transform it into a bill. They send it to Washington with lobbyists, have it signed off by everyone there, many of whom don't even bother reading it. And they also send it to their partners in the Western media to convince the public that this is something that is absolutely necessary. And that's how U.S. foreign policy is actually created. And what are they doing right now? They are getting this sanction war laid out, and they are talking about how to build consensus among the public, and also between themselves and their allies. They already saw what happened with Russia. But they have no other plan. There's no other alternative plan. So even though they're lying to themselves about how it went with Russia, they're not facing the reality of how those sanctions actually really went, and they're getting ready to do it to China. So this isn't diplomacy. They're not listening to China. They're talking at China. They're not talking with China. China's place is beneath the United States and the collective West. That's how it's always been throughout generations. The West cannot even imagine any sort of alternative where a non-white nation, and that's what this is about, a non-white nation surpassing not just the US, but the collective West, which is what's happening. That is what is happening, and they cannot tolerate that. They cannot accept that, and they are making irrational decisions and pursuing irrational foreign policy objectives to try to prevent this from happening, despite all of the metrics back in reality saying that what they're trying to do doesn't make any sense and is impossible. But they're going to try to do it anyway. Look at these people and just ask yourself, look at the panels, the Council on Foreign Relations panel, or anyone involved in the Atlantic Council, these warmongers, these elitists. Just ask yourself, are they capable of any sort of humility, the ability to acknowledge that there is something greater than them, and that they should at least have mutual respect for another nation? They're incapable of it. It is something inside their brain that they are physically, psychologically incapable of, and they're going to plunge the West into a destructive confrontation one way or the other with China. They're already doing it. They're actually already doing it with China. They're going to escalate it with China. That's where we are right now.
Well, I wanted to share this because you mentioned the lack of humility and just how there is this consensus in the U.S. political and foreign policy establishment. But there's also this consensus in the media. I mean, look at the way that the media portrays the U.S.-China tensions. Here you have the New York Times basically saying, would Americans allow the Biden administration to reduce tensions? And so basically what it's saying is that Americans' views of China are resembling their view of the Soviet Union decades ago. And that is what's going to make it harder to mend ties. And then they, this pollster over at the New York Times publishes these polls, right, with the increasing dissatisfaction of the Soviet Union in the mid-40s after World War II, where you have this massive jump in dissatisfaction. And then you have here from 2014 to 2023, you start at 2014, it's around 50-55% unfavorable, and then boom, jumps during the Trump administration to nearly 80%. And look at that jump during the Biden administration. I mean, this is 2023, where unfavorable views are now in, it looks like it's getting up to the 90% range, mid-80s, 90%. But that is how the New York Times is portraying this. It's Americans that are keeping the Biden administration from doing this. Yeah, it's democracy keeping the Biden administration from alleviating tensions. However, now you have a delegation. You have a U.S. Congress, a U.S. House delegation, right, as part of this so-called committee against the Communist Party, the Armed Services Committee. Chairman is in Taiwan right now, Mike Rogers, and he's going to be there for 3 days. This is another escalation of just at this question alone. But we just said that Taiwan, it's all part of this larger strategy. What's your take? Now, this is another crossing of China's red line too. So as you have the media blaming Americans for their anti-China sentiment and pushing anti-China and aggressive policy towards China, you have literally U.S. politicians touching down on Taiwan and violating the one China principle.
Well, I wonder if there's a graph that you could find that would show us the amount of money spent by the U.S. government on anti-China propaganda, because we have definitely seen a leap in anti-China propaganda. We've covered this for years now. The so-called Uyghur genocide in Xinjiang. This is to China what WMDs was to Iraq. It's just this completely fabricated story. It's actually the result of U.S.-sponsored terrorism inside of China that China was reacting to, and they don't tell you about the terrorism. They just show the reaction, and then they also lie about it to make it as if there's some sort of genocide taking place. And they have been hammering this into to the American people's minds for years and years now. That, Tibet, even longer, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the media operation has only expanded. They admitted that they were going to set aside millions and millions of dollars for media specifically targeting China. They made an announcement where they actually talked about this. And then it's no surprise that the American people are now anti-China. Obviously, they're going to be anti-China because they're in an environment where everything they hear is anti-China. So it's interesting how the New York Times, which is definitely a willing and deliberate party to this propaganda campaign, they're saying, oh, the American people have spoken. The U.S. government's hands are tied. There's nothing they can do. The American people demand this. The American people demand this because you've poisoned their minds deliberately with a concerted media campaign to poison them against China. That's why. So this is the joke. When I said democracy, it's absolutely in reverse. It is the government putting these ideas into the people's heads and then pretending that somehow it was generated by the people. Again, it starts in these think tanks. It goes off to Washington to be rubber stamped, and it goes to their media partners to be drummed into the minds of the American people. So that's where we are right now. This is the propaganda campaign that they've invested in for years now, finally paying off. Yes, now everyone hates China. How many Americans actually know anything about China? How many have gone to China? How many have actually watched a video with no commentary, just watched a video, someone with a 4K camera just walking through the streets of China? I guarantee you that it's probably single-digit percentile. They know nothing about China except what they see on CNN, on Fox, on the BBC. And we know that these are all verified serial liars. So that's one aspect of it. I don't remember your other question. You had another question, Danny, but I can't remember. That part, the New York Times acting as if the American people, we have to listen to the American people. Like, that part is just so absurd, but this is what they always do. I guarantee you, China is not the first thing the New York Times is telling the truth about. I guarantee you they're lying about that. We've proven that they're lying about these things. What was the other part of the question, Danny?
Well, yeah, as you were talking, I mean, you were mentioning the millions of dollars that the United States is pouring into anti-China, literal anti-China propaganda. I believe it was last year, in February, there was an addition of like $500 million set aside for Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, all of these CIA cutouts to pour into them money for China misinformation, essentially. And so, yeah, it's a very real phenomenon. But the other side of this is, as the New York Times is blaming the Americans, blaming people in the United States who are literally just listening and ingesting whenever they're paying attention, which honestly is not too much. But for those who are paying attention, who end up being subjects in these polls, they're watching as U.S. politicians. Now you have the head of the U.S. Armed Services Committee, Mike Rogers. He is now in Taiwan. So this follows Kevin McCarthy. Yeah, yes. He follows Kevin McCarthy, following Kevin McCarthy's visit with Tsai Ing-wen here in the United States, following Nancy Pelosi's, of course, landmark visit. You also had on the UK side, Liz Truss has visited. There's been many instances where the collective West, with the U.S. spearheading this, is crossing this red line. And I mean, to do that, and of course, all the propaganda that surrounds Taiwan alone, right? Because Taiwan is framed as this country. It's not a country, but this country that's being aggressively bullied by China, and the U.S. is going in there to assert democratic values. So your reaction to this latest crossing of China's red line?
Yes, that was the second part. It was about Taiwan. So one of the components of this visit by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was him publicly reciting the U.S. One China policy. What is the One China policy? It is the United States recognizing officially that there is only one China. Taiwan is part of China. There's only one legitimate government in China. It's the People's Republic of China in Beijing. And if you go to the U.S. State Department's website right now on U.S. relations with Taiwan, they will say explicitly, we do not recognize Taiwan independence. We don't support Taiwan independence, something to that effect. And yet at the exact same time they're doing that, acknowledging China's sovereignty over Taiwan, they are blatantly violating China's sovereignty over Taiwan by sending these people from Congress to Taiwan without Beijing's approval to encourage separatism on the island province of Taiwan. They're also sending weapons to Taiwan. Could you imagine if there was some breakaway region inside the continental US or right off the coast and China was saying, well, we recognize that as American, and then they're sending weapons. They've handcrafted the government that is leading it, that is pursuing separatism. Nobody would tolerate that for a moment, and yet this is exactly what the United States is doing. So as the U.S. is pretending to be diplomatic and trying to smooth over ties with China, they are deliberately and blatantly violating Chinese sovereignty regarding Taiwan. So that again, that is what I've been saying. And they know that China is going to react to that. So what is the American people who are being lied to, who the U.S. sets aside hundreds of millions of dollars every year to lie to them about China? How are they going to see this? They're going to see Blinken going to Beijing, trying to extend the olive branch, and then they're going to see China complaining about Taiwan, which American people know nothing about and don't understand. Again, I talk to American people who think Taiwan is a country, and as Carl Za often says, if they even can differentiate it from Thailand, that would be amazing if they could even do that. And so this is the problem. And they're doing the exact same thing that they did to Russia and Iran. They pretend, they do this song and dance that they're pursuing peace with these nations while blatantly, deliberately violating their national security and their sovereignty, trying to provoke them and then point at them and say, look, we were the peacemakers. Look at how irrational and belligerent they are. Unfortunately, we have to apply sanctions. Unfortunately, we need to prepare for war with this country. That it is the U.S. In violation of international law, provoking and violating the sovereignty of.
Yeah, I mean, there really is no question about it, and it was quite a set. This is, generally you hear Biden and Blinken in the past and others say, oh yeah, no, we're still for the one China policy, one China principle, but you don't necessarily see it recited. And in Blinken's readout, in his post Beijing visit presser to the media, he did list it out. He talked about the 3 joint communiques, the 6 assurances, and all that has transpired since the infamous Nixon visit, where this all started to be rolled out and agreed upon. Yet you don't really hear Biden and Blinken necessarily oppose the actions of what their counterparts. And this is this could be framed as a partisan issue. It is not a partisan issue, but it could be framed if the Biden administration truly wanted it to be, because it is now, given the shape of Congress, it is the GOP that essentially is spearheading all of these dangerous visits to Taiwan and stomping on China's red line on this question. What do you make of this? Maybe we can close the China discussion here on, why do you feel like Biden and Blinken do not speak up? Because on the one hand, it could be argued that this makes them look politically weak in the face of their opposition. So why would they want to be in that position?
I think the U.S. uses its 2-party system to as a smokescreen, as plausible deniability, where they can say, well, we're trying to make peace with Beijing, but it's, the other party, we have absolutely no control over them, violating both U.S. and international law. We're powerless to stop them from doing this. We're also powerless from stopping the flow of weapons and the sailing of warships all along China's coast. Utterly powerless when the president is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. This could all easily be stopped. But they're not doing it. They're not doing it on purpose. It's just like when President Obama, signing the U.S.-Iran nuclear deal. From the very beginning, it was designed to fail. It was a trick, essentially. And you had the right wing in American politics, or whatever you want to call it, the Republicans. That is a political minefield there. But whatever you want to call it, they were constantly aggressive, belligerent toward Iran. They kept the hatred toward Iran going, so that you have these dynamics where they're still the bad guy. No one, because they don't want the American people to think that there actually is peace developing. They want to keep that hatred going. Someone has to do that. It can't be President Obama and his political party. They're pretending to be peacemakers. So it's a very convenient arrangement that they have. And we know that it doesn't matter who's in the White House, who's in Congress. There's continuity of agenda for these foreign policy objectives. Like I said, you go to the U.S. State Department's official website. They have papers that if you read it, it's from the 1950s. If you read it, it sounds like something that you could have heard yesterday on CNN or Fox News.
Indeed. Well, maybe we have some time for questions. There were a few trickling in super chats. A reminder that if you become Patreon Substack members, links in the description, you can submit questions. I usually get to those first. There were none in those areas, I don't believe in those, but you can, if you become a member, submit those as well, either by comment or digital message. I'm actually going to check really quick before to see if there was okay. So no. So let's get to the super chats then. We had a few questions here. Let's go from the bottom up. Elena Diaz said, why are U.S. citizens always willing to follow their crazy leaders and always prepared to make enemies out of any of us in the world? Well, I don't know if this was a rhetorical question. I don't think it was. But Brian, what's your take on this?
It goes back to the media. The information space of any given nation is feeding the collective mind of those people. Just like when you eat food, you're feeding your body. And if you're eating a good diet, you're going to be strong and healthy, resilient and constructive, productive every day. And if you're eating poison, you're going to be sick all the time. You're not going to be very productive. And if you're doing drugs and your state of reality, your grasp on reality is being altered, that you may hurt yourself or others. And it's the same in terms of information space. It is possible to poison an entire population by drumming lies into their head every single day. We see it. We see it manifesting itself all across the West, with the U.S. proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, with this growing conflict the U.S. is provoking with China. We can see it. We can see how dangerous it is. And if we war game this out to its final conclusion, how deadly this could possibly be. Look at what happened with Iraq. Look at what happened with Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. There's real world consequences for these lies. So why are U.S. citizens following their leaders? It comes down to education and media, which unfortunately the government has more or less a monopoly on. The government and the interests that drive what they do. And so this is why American people go along with it. It's not that American people are fundamentally or inherently bad. They're not. There's so much potential being wasted in the United States because of the small handful of people in Washington and on Wall Street right now.
Indeed. And there's also, I think that there are layers to it. There are people who live in the United States who are indeed very enthusiastic about what their government does abroad. We can't avoid that reality. However, there's also just many more who, because of the noise and because of just the divisions and also just life in the United States is quite difficult for most people. I mean, if 80% of people live paycheck to paycheck, you have a society where most people are generally not thinking about the United States' role in the world. And so that then leaves this tiny minority. I believe it's a minority, and it's the people who are polled who actually have these strong negative opinions. But most people are either just misinformed, misdirected, or just pick, it's kind of like when you go into the SATs and you don't study, you're kind of just picking what's in front of you, and I think
Yes.
that's
Yes.
kind of how it is. That's kind of how it feels like in the United States, at least.
Danny, they
me
always
here.
say you should, if it's multiple choice, always pick C, because there's like some sort of statistical probability that it'll be more right than any other letter. And for Americans, it seems like they always pick sanctions and war against other countries. That's their go-to. If they don't know the answer, war.
Right. All right. And
Unfortunately.
unfortunately, also, unlike the SATs where there might be other options, it's not just B, C, there's an A and a D. However, on this test, the other options are actually scribbled out. You don't,
Yes,
there's
that's a good
no
point.
coverage of it. It's like, independent media, people who are doing work for peace, whether it's activism or otherwise, they tend to not have the platforms and the megaphones large enough to reach lots and lots of people, and that is by design. There's one other question, Brian, here. Where is it? Okay, so we have, let me hide this one. Where? Oh, here we go. Elena Diaz again. So 2 questions from Elena. Hasn't it been a mistake that Russia hasn't targeted NATO command centers from the beginning as a deterrent? What's your take on this? I believe they're talking about Ukraine here.
You have to think about the different perspectives and the different groups of people involved in this conflict, from the public in Russia, the public in Europe, the public in the United States, the political spheres of each of these regions, economics, military. Everything has to be considered together. If you started by attacking NATO centers in Europe, that would be a declaration of war. And in the eyes of the world, the entire world would say, why did Russia do that? They didn't need to do that. Even though, okay, you could say that it's justified. They're obviously the ones directing the conflict. But this is what Russia is so good at: escalation management. They are able to manage it, and they're able to they have a dominance over the escalation. They want to keep as many options open as possible for leverage over the worst impulses that NATO has, that their idea of going into Ukraine. If they already started doing that and NATO already countered it, and that was already going on, that's one less card Russia would have to throw on the table and say, if you go into Ukraine with your warplanes, this is what we're going to do to your facilities across NATO. So we have to think about it long term. We have to think about it. It's like chess. Sometimes the obvious move is not the best move. Sometimes that is the worst move to make. It's a trap.
Yeah, indeed. And that's all for the questions from Super Chats. However, let me just hide this one. I wanted to ask you something because I get it all the time. There's this suggestion from those who disagree with our viewpoints, and usually it's in incredibly bad faith, but oftentimes we don't respond to the question. I'm wondering what your response is, given that you live in Thailand. Oftentimes when we talk about Russia and China and developments geopolitically in the way that we do, we get the, why don't you just move to those countries a response, and I'm wondering what your take on that would be, given that you did move to Thailand, and given that it is this incredibly bad faith response, but I'm curious about how you would respond to it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, my response is I did leave the West. I don't live in the West, and I don't regret that. I mean, there are times where I just think, looking at what's going on there, and it's tragic. It really is. I can't even imagine what my life would be like if I was still there in the West. I see people in the comment section, is Thailand Western? It is not Western. Thailand has this bad reputation from the Vietnam War because, and it's not as if they had a choice. They hosted U.S. troops, or else they were going to be the next nation bombed into oblivion. Since then, so much has changed. Almost right after the Vietnam War ended and U.S. troops left the region, Thailand immediately repaired its ties with Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and also China. And now, this very day, China is Thailand's largest trade partner, investor, source of tourism. More tourists come from China than all other Western countries combined. They're building infrastructure together, including a high-speed rail link that will connect Thailand to China. And this is the reason why right now the United States is actually meddling heavily in Thai politics to reverse the close and growing relationship Thailand has with China. So I'm here in Southeast Asia. I can see with my own two eyes, I've been here almost 20 years. I can see with my own two eyes what the West has given, or I should say taken from the region, and what China has given to the region. You can see the difference. It's night and day. You could see the United States meddling in absolutely everything, poisoning absolutely everything, and China just coming and doing business and minding their own business, not sticking their nose in Thailand's political affairs. And think about it. Think about from an ideological point of view. A lot of people like to look at the world through ideological lenses. China is supposed to be a communist country. Thailand is a constitutional monarchy. You would think that they wouldn't be such great friends, but actually they are. And as a matter of fact, the princess speaks Mandarin and travels to China all the time, meets Chinese President Xi Jinping, got an award from him, and they're very close together. So people need to look at reality. What is actually happening versus these stereotypes and these assumptions based on analysis by ideology or analysis by analogy. These are very bad ways to look at the world. We have to actually look at the facts, follow the money, look at the numbers, and see where things actually exist.
Yeah. And I think, when it comes to this question of why don't you move there, it's a complete detachment from the political, geopolitical substance, right? It's because you don't like what we say, then it automatically means that, and it's a leftover of McCarthyism, because it automatically means you need to be ejected, and that was a very popular framework and idea, especially during the McCarthy period, was if you don't toe the line on U.S. foreign policy toward the Soviet Union, China, so-called communist states, then if you don't want war with those countries and you don't support war against any country, because it wasn't just communist-led countries the U.S. was waging war with during that period, then you are a traitor, you're treasonous, and you need to be deported. Some people actually did get deported. And so that's, to me, where that framework, that idea comes from, that like response, you got to go because and I'm sure a lot of people can relate in the audience here because it is a very common response. I probably get that comment on videos every day.
Well, also, Danny, I've been to China and it's amazing. And I think what a part of that comment is implying that, China is a hellhole. I saw some video from the 1960s and I just imagine it's still like that. Like they're all on bicycles and living in in their own, they're all reclining, doing opium, but it's not like that at all. As a matter of fact, when I was in China, this was in 2007, already at that point, everything was cleaner, better organized, more functional, more efficient than in what I was doing. Was I had traveled across the entire U.S. and I traveled almost entirely across China. And again, the difference is night and day. As a matter of fact, Danny, I think you're preparing for a trip to
Friday.
China. So it's going to be interesting to see what your take is, because you're actually going. So why don't you go there, Danny? So Danny's going to China.
Yeah. Second time, actually. I'm very excited. Second time in 4 years, I guess, since we're almost headed to the 4-year point when I visited the first time in December of 2019. And this time around, unlike then, I was not really I wrote a couple articles and I did have some footage, but I really wasn't doing video. But this time around, I'm going to have, very modest vlogging equipment, but it's good enough. I used it in Europe, and so it's good enough to use. And so I definitely will be showing life there and hopefully being some kind, active in that way to some extent. But yeah, when I was first there I had a very similar reaction, because no matter how much I didn't necessarily believe in the propaganda, if you hear it enough, it's just there in your mind. You might not be looking to confirm it, but you might be reacting to it as you're interacting with this environment. And that was my reaction, was, wow, this is very clean, very organized. People are living a lot better, and most people and
Safer.
safer. And if you just listen to what both the government and what a lot of people say is, wow, I couldn't imagine living like this. My parents, my grandparents, they couldn't live like this. You can meet people in the United States who are Chinese who talk like that, where they talk about, it was just 30 years ago, 40 years ago, where we were just in the countryside living without running water. And it wasn't that long ago that China was extremely poor. I mean, extreme poverty was just eradicated a few years ago. So when I was there, you could see the fruits of that. You can see the improvement, the progress, and also just the mentality is just so much different. There is no thirst for war there. Actually, all the people that I would speak to would say, why is your government so crazy? Like, why do they like guns so much, and why do they want to come to war with us? Because we just have no interest in that. And so that's like the most apolitical person there. That's how they talk. They're like, we don't want that. So that's crazy.
And they don't.
Like, stop it.
They don't hate Americans. People here in Thailand that understand what the U.S. is doing to Thailand. This is a very sensitive issue for them. And yet they don't hate Americans. They don't hate America. They know that it's the government. They know that it's special interests. And the other thing I was going to say was, people who think China, the Communist Party of China is communist. Look at that red flag. Did you go there and people are living their lives and doing business, owning property, just like everywhere else on Earth. And I'm sure, there's obviously an emphasis on state-owned enterprises and the government having the final say and everything. But the way they're doing business there is not entirely unlike everywhere else in the world. You would have to explain to me what you even mean by communist, because when you go there, so that's another reason people should go there and look. Or at least go on YouTube and check out those 4K walking or driving videos. And look, they've got stores where you can buy stuff with money. I mean, and people with their own businesses, right? I mean, I don't know what their definition of communism is. So it's like this infection in their brain that I think straddles both racism and just an irrational, ignorant understanding of whatever capitalism and communism is, this argument that they ideologically have versus how countries actually work in the real world.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting about China, I'm really excited to see how it's changed, because it's always changing. But one of the most interesting things that I noticed was, well, on the one hand, yeah, you do have the big state-owned enterprises, especially the financial institutions. They dominate very intentionally, because we were told when we were there that if you don't control your financial system, then you're bound to be looted. That's basically how it was framed. It's like, if your government doesn't control that, then companies are just going to loot it. And it was a direct reference to how it works in the United States, where people get really, really, really rich, a very tiny few people off the financial system, and the money supply is directed not in the interest of the country. So but with that said, when I was there, it's like, you have of course, the state-owned companies, you have them in tech, you have them in all the big sectors, and you also have the foreign investment that you see in some respects. I would say it's a lot, depending on where you go. I'm going to be in Shanghai this time. At some point, I know it's a lot more prominent there, but where Beijing and everywhere else I went, Urumqi, it's not as intense. What you do see much more of, though, is private businesses that are Chinese. They're just Chinese private businesses. And one of the things that people will tell you is that because their money supply, their financial system is in the control of the government, that means that it's much easier to conduct business in China, because you do not have to rely on predatory banks to loan you money. Like, you can, if you have a viable idea, if it's worth it, if you're able, yeah, you can start a business, and the government will be heavily regulated. Government institutions will be heavily regulated to help you do that. So that's what I notice is like all across the city in Beijing, it's just a bunch of private businesses, and they all look like they're able to survive, likely because of government support. And that seems like a strange notion now, I think, in the US and the collective West, when their governments are literally just funneling money to weapons, to big banks, and investment. I mean, they're about to do an investment ban on China, investment is just not, it's not really the priority.
Well, also, it's hard for people in the West, I think, especially Americans, to imagine the government actually investing in the people. That's an alien concept to them. They don't. That's something that some people say, oh, it shouldn't, because they're ultra capitalists or libertarians and they don't want any government at all, which I think is kind of unrealistic. But there's also people that wish that the government did, but they just simply aren't doing it. And I mean, look at the U.S., look at the infrastructure, look at the education system, just look at it. And then if you go to other countries, China is one of them. Here in Thailand, even, the government invests in the people. They invest in things that benefit the people, where there is profit involved, but the primary goal is a purpose for the people. Profit comes secondary. It's necessary. It comes secondary to creating this, whatever the organization is or whatever the infrastructure is, to serve the people and their ability to go about their daily business. And that's a sustainable way to run a country. You'll still make loads of money. You'll be prosperous. You might not be able to maximize your profits, but it's sustainable over the long term. And we can see in the US, when you obsess over profits only, it turns into a pyramid scheme, essentially. And then everything is destined to collapse eventually. You cannot sustain that. You cannot be taking away from the people, taking away from infrastructure, healthcare, education, and think that you can sustain a society like that. You simply cannot. And the US actually used to be much more balanced in that respect. And this is something that has slid downhill. And as it has slid downhill, you can see that the country has followed. So there's a lot to think about. People should just, whatever it is, if it's something that you don't actually know anything about, China's on the other side of the planet for most people in the West, keep an open mind and look into it. Do your own research. You don't have to listen to me or Danny. Just do some of your own research and ask yourself if you're being objective, and are you keeping your mind open? Are you following the truth wherever it brings you, even if it contradicts some of your preconceived notions? Just do that. I'm sure that it might not live up to what we're saying, but it'll definitely challenge your perception of it right now. And it's important to do that, because that's how you drain the swamp of public support for the U.S. when it decides to pick another country and go to war with it. I'm guaranteeing you, the U.S. lied about Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Ukraine, Russia. This is not the first time they're telling the truth. They are also lying about China. They're lying about China more than anywhere else, because the stakes for the U.S. are so high. This is the one country that can and is going to surpass the United States. So they have every motivation to lie about China.
Yeah, indeed. And maybe we can close our conversation with, well, what about the social credit system? Because I often get that comment too. And I know you've done a lot of analysis on that, because usually it's like, we make these points about, well, I mean, China's not perfect. China still has problems. Hell, I'm about to go to China. I have WeChat and I really want to use WeChat Pay, but I can't, because you need a Chinese bank account. And I get there are probably reasons for that. But it's a little frustrating, because I'm going to go there and everyone uses WeChat Pay. I'm probably going to get in a cab sometime and they're going to look at me like I have two heads, because I'm not using my phone to pay for the ride. But anyway, with that said, of course, China isn't perfect. China still has problems, and it seems committed to resolving them the best that they can. And it's not the U.S.'s business to interfere. But in any event, like, the social credit system always comes up. It's always like this thing of like, this is the thing that will prove that China actually is bad. So what's your take?
people need to read the articles in the Western media about the so-called social credit system very carefully, because even in the Western media, they will admit, buried deep in the body of the article, that it doesn't exist, that they have private companies that have certain like point systems, which you have it. I don't know. It's a coffee shop. You get 10 coffees, you get one free, and they have a system to keep track of it. But that's just for the coffee thing. You don't actually have to be in that. You could go to another place that doesn't have that. And it's the same in China. If you're on the train, you ride the train all the time, and you're sitting in other people's seats, you're smoking someplace where you're not supposed to, you're creating some kind of problem, they're gonna keep track of that. And if you continuously do it, you're not going to be allowed on the train, which is the way it has always worked everywhere, except recently in the West, where the police are not on the police don't go on the trains. There is no measures. There are rules that are just ignored, and there's penalties that are not enforced, and it makes it unbearable to use public transportation. So they don't do that in China. They don't do that in a lot of countries. They have rules, they have regulations, they enforce it, and there's penalties for breaking these rules and regulations. It is not a universal social credit system. There is no such thing, does not exist. Get a Chinese friend, or get a couple of Chinese friends, people who are proud to be Chinese, proud of what their country has achieved, not these malcontents who leave China and hate China, and they say bad things about China so they could fit in with the cool crowd in the West. Find some Chinese friends who actually are proud of their country and listen to them. Listen to their point of view. Listen to what they have to say about daily life in China.
Yeah, indeed. It's, China is for the Chinese. I mean, they are the ones who will determine what is positive, what is negative about their development path. And it's so funny because I remember this Business Insider article that you covered. I've covered it here, talking about the social credit system, where they literally admit it doesn't actually exist in the way that is being thought of, and that any kind of rollout of a social credit system where behavior is then marked with rewards is by private companies. And actually, what's funny about this is I've seen coverage of this rollout of this like experiment for private companies to like reward consumers based on their various behavior, usually consumption behavior and the financial behaviors, that young people actually really like it, because if they like do things like save money and do things that are pretty basic, and it's like not break the law, not break traffic laws, that kind of thing, then they like get free stuff. It's like yeah. they get discounts on things, and it's just it's not so, I guess it doesn't have the teeth that it often is presented as having.
What they imagine. What they imagine it as is they have cameras in your house, and if you don't salute your picture of President Xi Jinping, then like a police car is waiting for you outside. That's what they imagine it to be, and it's nothing even close to that. And what it actually is very similar to a lot of systems in the Western's point. I don't know about if it's everywhere, but there are point systems when you're driving. If you lose X number of points, you lose your license. There are things like that in China, and it's a huge country. It's the largest population in the world, or India's, I think they're like neck to neck now, but they have got a lot of people. It's the same population as the U.S. with 1.1 billion extra people. That's a lot of people. So they use technology to keep track of everything, and it works, and people are happy with it. And again, when I debunked the social credit system claim, I used only Western media sources to do it. I went into their articles and I showed you the subsequent paragraphs buried in the article that admit that everything in the headline is misleading, if not an outright lie. And when you actually read about the system, it makes a lot of sense, how it's actually working and what it actually is, versus what they try to make you think is this all-seeing eye, and nothing you do goes unnoticed and unpunished.
Totally. Well, Brian, I've kept you a while, but it's been a really good conversation. We'll have to connect when I'm back from China.
Yes, I want to have you on a live stream on my channel once you get back, because you had
Totally.
also been in Europe, and I want to.
Yeah, we can do a
Here's some compare and contrast. Yes.
Oh my gosh, yes, it will be. I have a lot of things to say about my trip to Europe. I haven't really commented on it that much, but I'm sure there will be a lot to compare and to especially contrast, because Europe had some, of course, good points to it, but the decline is everywhere. And unless you're just closing your eyes, or maybe you're an American who, I'm one of these people. It's like things are so bad. And if you know nothing about geopolitics of what's happening, you can say, things are at least a little better in certain areas here. It negates the fact that there is just a lot of decay happening. So it'll be very interesting. And yes, I can't wait to reconnect with you. But yeah, we'll be in touch. I'll be in your time zone, so I can actually be in touch a little bit easier too. So I'll be in touch. And thanks for coming on. And but everyone stick around. There's some announcements and things I want to talk to you about. But have a good rest of your night, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on, and have a safe trip.
Of course.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Okay, so that was a really good conversation. Give me a minute. I need to plug in and let me know if I have if my audio changes. And I'm going to do some announcements, super chats. Maybe I'll cover a story. It's possible I'll do a story, but give me 1 second here. I'm actually going to put on my Be Right Back card. All right, so here we go. All right, I'm back. How do I sound? Let me know. Sometimes when I plug in, I'm getting a new laptop. All right, I'm getting a new computer. I need to get it probably. Well, I think I'm going to get another laptop. I want to be able to travel with it. Please do support this show, though. So the first announcement is, yes, I need new equipment, and I'm also going to China, and I'll talk a little bit about that before I leave here. But do support this show. So independent media is under attack. I am making major upgrades. This show, I want it to be sustainable in the long term. And so to help make that happen, you can do that by becoming a member monthly or annually on Patreon, patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. Suggest guests, suggest content, communicate with me. There are many perks to doing so. There's also Substack as an annual option and a monthly option. People tend to like that. And you can also become a YouTube member. Had some great YouTube members. Usually there's more than a few in the chat, which I will shout out. So please do support there. If $4.99 per month is just better for you on this platform. And then there are one-time options in the link tree in the video description and the channel banner. So I believe it's PayPal, Cashapp. You can also contribute. So thank you. Thank you to Rockfin family. I do see you out here. Thank you so much, Rockfin. Thank you to all the moderators. I didn't get to thank you in the beginning of the show, so thank you for doing all that great work moderating. And thanks to all the super chats, which I will shout out later in the show. But thank you so much for your support. It's another great way to support. And of course, there are free ways. So, liking the stream is probably the most important, or leaving a comment, or both, depending on what you prefer. So with that said, I wanted to first, let's go over a few announcements. I might cover a story at the end here. But before I do that, yes, this is my last stream before I head to China. I actually have to make some pretty good preparations, both for the channel. I post clips usually from the archives while I'm gone on break. But I leave Friday morning, and I will be landing in Beijing on the 1st, pretty late. It's going to be a wild ride. And I'm going to be spending a few days there attending a conference. But I am doing some tourism, attending a conference. I hopefully will be able to meet with some folks in Beijing. It might be, but I will be there. Then I'm going to Gansu Province, Danhuang, Lanzhou, and that should be beautiful. And then Shanghai is where I will be ending the trip. So we are going to have a good time. I hope to publish some videos. I hope I can get some videos up while I'm there. Maybe even a stream, 1 or 2, where I can show off what China is like, depending on how much free time I have. Some people say, "Will I be meeting up with Li Jingjing?" I hope so. I hope I can meet up with her. And so, yes, there will be multiple friends who hopefully will be there at the same time, and hopefully I'll have some time to make those meetups happen. But in any event, so that's happening. I will be gone. I will return on the 11th of July, and I can't promise I will be streaming with the jet, depending on the jet lag goes. I do have Richard Wolff scheduled for the 17th, economist Richard Wolff, for the channel, and I'm sure I'll be collaborating with Brian and others when I get back, but I cannot promise that I will be back right on the 11th. Perhaps it'll be more later that week. The jet lag will, from what I remember it being, it will be a journey in terms of how I'm feeling for quite some time. In any event, that's those are the big announcements. Okay, those are the big announcements. Let me see if I'm forgetting anything. No, just remember there are clips coming while I'm gone as well. Okay. So let's get to some super chats. Let me shout out the super chats and the YouTube members as well. So let me see if I can. I'm just going to try to scroll, see if I see any other YouTube members. I see Ware. Thank you, Ware, for coming today. I believe you're also a moderator, I believe. I also see Valley here. I will shout out you on the super chats as well. So thank you so much for the double support. I'm trying to see if there are any other members in the chat today. I really appreciate all of the super chats I'm seeing, and I will get to them. They're all organized for me after I shout out the members. Any other YouTube members here? I see Valley. I see Where. Anyone else? I don't think so far. Also, you can leave a quick comment if you want to be shouted out if you're here as a member, and I'll get to it at the bottom of the screen. So yeah, we have a great YouTube membership community. They're very committed here very frequently. It's a pleasure to know that there are committed viewers to this channel. Very humbling, and I'm very appreciative of all of the support, of course. So with that said, let's get to the super chats then. And do put yourself at the bottom as a member if you are here. So Valley, thank you so much, membership, and for the thank you. We also have Rafael Legonde, maybe. Brian, when I was the third phase in boot camp, a Marine drill instructor told me everything you see here, you can't know what they are for real. Everything is staged. Could Russia stage this coup? Oh, okay. So it was a question. I could have asked that. I'm sorry. But thank you, Raphael, for the super chat. Because there has been that idea that this could have been staged. Not sure about whether that's true or not, but I've seen it. So David March said, I attended U.S. military industrial complex conference last week. They all believed the BS about Russia. It was scary how out of touch they were. Out of touch by design, I call it. Thank you so much for the super chat, because it's like, yeah, they're out of touch, but it really is that narrative. It's just the narrative serve so much purpose. I mean, think about it. The more you believe in the lies that you spew, the easier it is to enjoy the spoils, which the military industrial complex is indeed enjoying. So thank you so much for that. Nobody said, thank you so much again for coming, Nobody. Without sharing, there can be no justice. Without justice, there can be no peace. Without peace, there can be no future. So the world teacher, these truth speakers deserve much respect and support. Thank you so much for that quote and for the super chat. Raphael again said, Brian, yesterday was the third headquarters with the generals inside NATO lost in Ukraine. how any serious army can continue and to function well, sir. Yeah, okay, thank you so much. Elena, I shouted you out already. You asked questions. Thanks so much. And with our eyes rise, Prigozhin's placement in Belarus now gives Russia 55,000 allied troops in Belarus in the north to strike Kiev, while Ukraine focuses on the south. It's a good point. It'll remain to be seen. I mean, they'll be absorbed by Belarus. So, yeah, definitely, if they want to continue fighting, they'll have an opportunity potentially to continue fighting, or at least to be ready to fight. So Iris Enamorado, thank you so much for the super sticker. Elena, again, we asked this question. Thank you so much. Eileen Gibson, thanks so much for the super sticker. David Falconer, thanks so much. Wendy Sheets, thanks so much. Fred Stanley, thanks so much. And then we have who knows what says Brian, okay, sorry, I didn't get to this question. When do you predict the conflict in Ukraine may end barring nuclear escalation by the West? Sorry, I didn't get to that question. That was actually a very good question. You didn't ask for my opinion, but I will tell you my opinion. I don't think that the conflict in Ukraine will look the same. I can only predict that in 2024, there will be a moment. I don't know if it'll be the next 6 months, because I do think that the United States and NATO are going to try to push this offensive months and months and months. Whether you can call it offensive or just literally pushing this outright conflict months and months. But I do think by 2024, perhaps even early 2024, I don't think the conflict can look the same. So how it will end, though, I do not know, because perhaps it ends in its current form and takes another form, like NATO intervention. Whether there's a freeze or negotiations, it's just hard to see right now. So hard to answer this question. Very good question, but we will see if there is a true end. They're not giving any indications. So Mark, thank you so much for the super sticker. And Andy says, enjoy China and be that man on the street reporting back to us. I'm going to Chongqing in September to say bye to my friends there, as the politics are so uncertain these days. Wow. Well, enjoy Chongqing. I mean, that's where Alex from Reporterify lives. Covers a lot. I hope to meet up with him, not in Chongqing, because I definitely won't have time to get out there. But I hope that he's able to meet me, and I hope you enjoy your time. Thank you so much. It's a very generous super chat, by the way, Andy. Thank you so much. Hope you enjoy your time there. I heard it's a beautiful city. Seen Alex's videos on it. I know it's Carl Zaw's home city as well. So enjoy. Robert Smart, thanks so much for the super chat. All right, that does it for the super chats. So let me cover one more thing for you. I've wanted to cover this story for a while. It's an evergreen story, but nonetheless, I think it's important. So let me do this, and then we'll end the stream, okay? So again, reminder, support the channel, patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong, Substack, YouTube membership. There's Linktree with one-time options. Do support the channel. Help cover the cost of this trip. It helps me update this equipment and helps bring this channel closer to sustainability. Now, I want to cover BRICS again. I told you I was probably going to talk about this at least once per month as we head to the summit, if not more than once per month. And it's not as if there's a lot of breaking stories about BRICS right now. I mean, you've had BRICS receive interest from more than 20 countries, Bangladesh being the latest. You've also had France, Emmanuel Macron, say that he wants to observe the summit this coming August in Pretoria, I believe it will be. So the BRICS summit is coming, and it's coming pretty fast. It will follow NATO's summit in July. And the BRICS summit has been receiving a lot of attention because the foreign ministers have already met in South Africa. They've talked about a new currency. They've talked about admission. No real plans have been made for either just yet. But the new development bank is receiving new members as well. Egypt, I believe, being the latest to join. And so the BRICS train is indeed moving. And so there's a lot of talk about BRICS as a vehicle for the countries involved, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, to spearhead de-dollarization and complete the process and essentially provide an alternative financial mechanism to the US-led IMF and Bretton Woods institutions, as well as just the Western financial system as a whole. However, it's important to note that BRICS is indeed more than this, that there is a political element to BRICS and the BRICS Plus idea, the BRICS Plus development. It really is a shift in global political relations in the sense that you are having major, formerly overly exploited, underdeveloped countries. All of these countries still remain in the underdeveloped category, right? In official terms. And China says we are still an underdeveloped country, despite the modernization, despite the economic growth, despite the economic scale and the size and the progress and all of that. Still underdevelopment does exist in China. Russia, India, South Africa. Yes, all of these countries are poorer countries despite their rising stature, despite the fact that their economies are getting bigger, and they've come together to actually make up a greater share of global GDP than the G7 countries. So yes, these countries are all on the rise. China and Russia probably leading that development, and with India a little far behind, but not too far. But them coming together is a statement that there is a huge interest globally, worldwide, especially in the global south, in Asia, Africa, South America, the Caribbean, West Asia, everywhere, right? There's a huge interest in developing independently, in creating a fairer system, and in putting the keys of the car of the world economy in the hands not just of the global south, but in particular China and Russia. Because right now, Russia is leading, arguably, the de-dollarization process, and China, as an overall economic entity, is indeed leading the shift from a Western-led order, a Western-led economic order, to a China-led economic order that is fundamentally different, because China is not a hegemon and China is not seeking to prey upon, overly exploit, super exploit the global south. So it is a huge fundamental shift. But there's a gentleman, Tom O'Connor, who writes actually pretty interesting articles for Newsweek. And on any issues geopolitically, you will find Tom O'Connor in Newsweek gently and slightly challenging the general narrative about developments like BRICS. So if you read Newsweek or any Western mainstream media, you're going to get a lot of propaganda, anti-China, anti-Russia, new Cold War, anti-Iran, DPRK, whatever it is. But Tom O'Connor of Newsweek tends to write a little more honestly. And he wrote this article I found was very interesting. He said, BRICS is evolving from a Russia-China dream to a potential U.S. nightmare. And he wrote this in early June as there was a huge increase in conversation about membership increasing for BRICS, and about, let me actually adjust this picture, and about the future of this currency that they are contemplating. So, global interest among nations seeking to join the BRICS economic bloc led by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa is demonstrating its growing influence as a new geopolitical force with the potential of challenging the largely Western-led financial system. As the group prepares to hold a fateful conference this summer, transformations long in store for the international order are beginning to take effect. So Chris Devonshire Ellis of the Dezan, Shira and Associates business firm said the main drivers are to do with an overall belief that the U.S. has become both unreliable and overbearing in its foreign policy. So he continues that unreliability, such as issues concerning the recent U.S. debt ceiling, which has only been pushed back to 2025, and the risk of sanctions. he told Newsweek. Overbearing in that it has used international mechanisms to punish countries it doesn't agree with, such as cutting countries off from SWIFT, i.e. Russia, and has appeared to use the G7 as an economic gang to support and justify what it does elsewhere. So I said i.e. Russia, but there's more countries than Russia. Iran is also cut off, and all of the sanctioned countries essentially are cut off, and there's more than 20 of them around the world. So the debt ceiling forced President Biden to cut his Asia trip short after his appearance at the G7 last month in Hiroshima alongside leaders of Canada, the European Union, France, Germany, Japan, and the UK. And while the influential group sought to showcase a united front, another meeting held by leading diplomats of the 5 core BRICS members last weekend, so this was early June, so the beginning of June, in South Africa generated global interest. And so other countries, said Devonshire Ellis, are starting to become concerned at this type of behavior, unsustainable debt levels, and the imposition of a quote-unquote rules-based order in global economics that only appear to service the U.S. and its immediate allies at the expense of everyone else. So he added that, simply put, numerous global leaders from Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, and the Middle East, as well as China and Russia, have stopped believing in the U.S. as a responsible global leader. So again, it's much more than about currency. And so oftentimes the response I get, oh, BRICS is not going to be able to de-dollarize. BRICS is not going to be able, it's not as big as you say it is. It's small, it's puny, it's pathetic. All of this negates the fact that you have these massive economies, these massive global South economies politically making a decision, regardless of their development models. Because let's be honest, China and India have problems bilaterally. Brazil has had many political changes over the last few years. South Africa, right, admits this, an enormous debt upon itself from the West. There are, of course, intricacies and contradictions and complexities with the relationship among all these countries, but they've all politically decided to come together to chart a new course forward, and it's getting more popular. So countries around the world, especially in the global South, are looking at this and saying, this is our opportunity. And it's probably the only opportunity that exists right now to change the course of economic development away from Western parasitism. So BRICS, which began as just BRIC before South Africa's inclusion as a term of emerging economies coined by then Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill in 2001, held its first summit in 2009, but it has generated a sharp uptick in interest over the past year since China hosted a BRICS Plus meeting that drew 19 heads of state last June, so June of 2022. In the lead up to the recent BRICS ministerial in Cape Town, South Africa's ambassador at large to BRICS, Anil Suklal, told Newsweek that more than 20 countries have applied or expressed interest to join in becoming members of BRICS as it plans to debate the expansion at the upcoming August Leaders Summit to be held in Durban. So Durban, I've seen Pretoria, I've seen Durban. Anyway, maybe they're keeping this a secret, but that it's going to be held in South Africa, the August Summit of the heads of state. So Suklal emphasized at the time that BRICS did not see confrontation against any other blocs, including the G7, but rather saw cooperation creating a more equitable and inclusive international infrastructure or architecture. Arina Yarygina, head of the Economics of Banking Business Department at the Moscow Institute of Foreign Relations, echoed a number of these points. Actually, she said, globalization has reached a new stage of development associated with the formation of different alliances, she told Newsweek, whose members share the main principles of interaction, mutual respect, and equality within the framework of reaching definite economic and social problems in the interests of their nations. One of such kind of intergovernmental alliance is BRICS, she added, whose member countries do not seek to dominate, but are interested in constructive relations, ensuring secure well-being. I mean, that's the most important political point here. It's not just a matter of can we get out of the out from under the dollar's thumb, but can we secure well-being? It's a big part of that. So it's a big part of the BRICS process to increase well-being by being independent of the U.S. dollar. But it's not the only thing, right? Because investment is about a lot more than currency. So Georgina noted that the BRICS agenda encompasses an ambitious range of issues on which multilateral cooperation is sought, including security issues, post-pandemic recovery, technology sharing, sustainable development, and people-to-people exchanges. It's important for everyone to recognize that multipolarity of the world is a new process of globalization, she said, and to strive for compromises within the framework of creation for a better future for mankind. And so at the heart of BRICS is an effort to diversify market access away from the domination of the US dollar, by far the world's largest reserve currency, as well as the US-led financial networks subject to tools such as sanctions. So it's both, right? It is both. It is about increasing investment, cooperating on security, sustainable development, people-to-people exchange. It's basically strengthening ties independently of the collective West in all spheres. But at the heart is indeed to diversify market access away from domination of the US dollar, because it has been weaponized. The sanctions are just one form of that. But the whole world economy is weaponized against the global South when it comes to debt arrangements, loan arrangements, so many other areas, not to mention that it is cumbersome to attempt to trade, to attempt to increase your level of development when everything has to be exchanged in US dollars. It creates many kinds of different nightmares for countries looking to grow their economies and address real economic problems. So investment cooperation, along with other areas, is designed to strengthen balanced and inclusive economic growth and increase the level of international competitiveness of BRICS economies, Yaragina added. We consider these principles to be attractive to developing countries and highly appreciate their intention to join BRICS as a formation and a platform. So now we're going to talk about the BRICS Development Bank. And so leading this effort is BRICS' Shanghai-based New Development Bank, which has already expanded to include Bangladesh, Egypt, and the UAE as partners. So a senior researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs, Cobus van Staden, told Newsweek that the interest among developing countries to join the New Development Bank is driven by dual dynamics. There's a lack of development first in financing options open to the global South, particularly for concessional financing aimed at infrastructure development. This reality has significantly contributed to the current debt crisis in the global South because lack of concessional options forces countries toward market rate lending. So the New Development Bank opens another set of options for these countries in addition to traditional development finance sources like the World Bank. And that's important because if you look at a country like Sri Lanka, right, you'll see that the majority of its debt actually comes not from even these Bretton Woods institutions, but from private lenders. And that's because the World Bank and the IMF are very short on concessional loans. And they also don't want the optics of being the primary lender of bad loans, meaning loans that include huge trade-offs like austerity and neoliberalism and privatization, which is what happens in these countries, what happens to most of the global South. But they are very particular in not increasing financing to the point of dominating economies because they want to put African countries, West Asian countries, East Asian countries, they want to put all the global South, South American countries in a position where they have to seek out private lenders. And so a lot like Sri Lanka, for example, you'll find its debt portfolio is actually private lenders essentially loaning out to the government at incredibly high interest rates, where it just sinks their economy and they're never able to pay it off. And eventually they then have to look to the IMF and say, we need more. And then the IMF says, okay, privatize. So that's kind of the relationship. So that's one dynamic driving the interest of the New Development Bank that BRICS is spearheading, because BRICS doesn't have any of that. BRICS actually does the opposite. It says, no, we want to put together money from all of our economies. We want to put this pool of money for investment, and we want to loan it out at rates that are preferable so that you can develop your infrastructure. So second, a smaller subset of developing countries has complicated relations with Western powers, especially in relation to sanctions. For countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, the NBD, the DB, the New Development Bank, represents a potential source of financing and influence outside of forums dominated by Western norms and different forms of conditionality linked to financing from institutions like the World Bank. So the interest expressed by Riyadh and Tehran in joining BRICS and its new development bank has taken on a new light in the wake of Beijing's successful effort to broker a deal in March for the two long rivals to reestablish relations. So while von Staden stated that Russia and China have their own preoccupations around the use of dollar-targeted sanctions that are contributing to the sudden momentum in exploring alternative currency trade, he also said he was struck by the relative quick engagement from the rest of the developing world. I think this is partly informed by an alternative view of the global order coming from the global north and the global south. So essentially, this is kind of surprising too, because these countries, right, Russia and China, right, they're sovereign countries, they're big countries, they have big economies, they have done a lot of work to circumvent sanctions already. China, for decades upon decades, right, has been building up its market reforms to ensure that it's both integrated in the world economy, but also sovereign in the sense that it doesn't have to be dependent or rely on any one country. And that was the point, because even when normalization was reached with the United States, China was really already diversifying. It was looking at Sweden and European countries and Japan, right, as partners, because it didn't want to fall behind. Chinese leaders at the time were saying that if countries, and Deng Xiaoping was talking about this a lot during his tenure when opening up and reform started in 78, was saying that if they fall behind too far from other countries in the region, then the Chinese people will start to question the legitimacy of socialism. Is it truly better than capitalism? That was the reality of the conversation that they were having. They said, okay, well, we're going to ensure that we catch up and surpass. And so that was the goal. And they weren't going to do it with war and with aggression and with cutting off ties, but by strengthening ties. And so the spirit of that approach really flows through BRICS. And now global South countries are saying, well, we view this differently. We don't view what the U.S. is doing favorably, and we're going to join the new development bank so we can get a fairer deal. He pointed to a survey published in the European, so von Staden pointed to a survey published by the European Council on Foreign Relations February of 2023, 1 year after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which found vast differences in opinions expressed by respondents in the West from those in China, India, Russia, and Turkey. Respondents across 9 European Union countries, the US and the UK, were more likely to say that the conflict would produce a world divided between two blocs led by China and the US, while those in the 4 non-Western nations were more likely to choose a more even distribution of global power among multiple countries. The trend has been particularly evident during South Africa's BRICS chair tenure, as many nations across the continent see both China and the US as roughly equally popular, even while Washington warns nations against doing business with Beijing. Von Staden also noted that trade with Africa throughout all of 2022 was less than China's trade with the continent in just the first quarter of this year. So that's another trend that's fueling BRICS's rise, is the US's decline. Its influence is declining. African countries are not receiving, forget about fair deals, any deals, because the United States just isn't investing in Africa. So what's happening is China has come in, has supplanted, and that's a staggering number. That in the first quarter alone of this year, China has overtaken U.S. trade with Africa throughout all of 2022. So take that number, U.S. trade with Africa in 2022, probably roughly around 40 to 60 billion USD. Unclear. I forget the exact number. But China's trade with the continent in 1 quarter was equal to that. So it raises new challenges for U.S. foreign policy, said von Staden, because it will increasingly have to make allowance for these countries' desire to keep dealing with a wider range of global powers while also keeping traditional partners like the U.S. on board. Putting too much us versus them pressure on these countries risks them leaning more conclusively toward China, among other reasons because China is their main trading and financing partners. So it's not like countries need a reason to stick with China, given that it is the biggest trade partner for most countries in the world. So as BRICS sets its sight on expansion, however, there are also significant disputes among core members. Perhaps the most serious and difficult is the China-India relationship. The two countries have long been locked in a border dispute that sparked a war 6 decades ago and turned deadly again in 2020, with bilateral cooperation deteriorating between the adjoining states that are home to the world's 2 largest populations. So I talked to Vijay Prashad, but before I talk about what Vijay had to say, to Newsweek. It's important to note that Modi was recently in Washington over the past few days. So it's June 28th now as of this recording. But, June 26th, June 27th, Modi was in town. He got a hero's welcome. They kissed up to him. But if you understand that regardless of what happened at that Modi-Biden meeting, which, there was deals drawn, there are attempts, and India wants strong relationships with the United States. There were economic deals inked. There was a sense of history. There also is this tension, though, because, while the Biden administration is selling drones to India and building a semiconductor relationship with India, while it's doing all these significant economic dealings, trying to pull India away from BRICS, at the same time, you've had many articles in the mainstream media in the West talking about why India will never become a U.S. ally in this war on China. And you hear India's foreign ministry, regardless of all of the various ways that India has many tensions, and I believe India is the provocateur in these tensions. Regardless of that, they still say we are going to have good relations with all big powers, including China, to a significant degree. So it's not cut so black and white. But Vijay Prashad says China and India don't have any modus vivendi to deal with the disputes at hand. They're not just border disputes. They're pretty fundamental, even about questions of trade and international relations. That being said, Prashad has said that even India and China have been able to collaborate in BRICS and work through BRICS institutions. China and India are also members of another common bloc, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as is India's top rival, Pakistan. This group, which also includes Russia, along with 4 Central Asian states, is set to expand across geopolitical fault lines, with Iran on its way to full membership and Saudi Arabia being one of many countries who have applied for dialogue partner status. And so Vijay Prashad continues that this attitude has gained greater traction across the global south, given what he called a form of new non-alignment among countries such as Indonesia, Mexico, and Turkey, and therefore it's generated interest in BRICS. So in a sense, yeah, India will have problems with China. There's obviously going to be political differences, but they've been able to work through this mechanism. And this is what I think is so frightening, why Modi had to get a hero's welcome from Joe Biden during his visits, because there's this desperation setting in that no matter how close you get, you're not going to pull away India from China completely. And you're not going to get any country really to do that in the global south, in Asia, West Asia, Central Asia. It's just not going to happen. And so BRICS is kind of this incredible example in your face, in the US's face, that shows the writing on the wall. So in the past, Prashad said, when the United States or Western European countries talked about globalization, they talked about universal interests. Countries in the South felt, well, maybe there's something that to that, maybe there are global interests. But he noted that since the financial crisis of 2007, there's a growth of a mood which suggests, hey, listen, what you sold us as the global interest is actually your parochial interest, and we want to put forward our own national interest. And I think there's truth to that. I think it goes beyond the 2007, 2008 crisis. I think there are many factors that have pushed this. I think that economic crisis obviously devastated the global South to an even significant degree, more than the collective West. But there's been so many, from the wars, U.S. aggression in West Asia, the Middle East, to the sanctions, to the great power competition, all of these things. And when you hear the word great power competition, you have to think Cold War, and Cold Wars have always affected smaller countries, the global South in particular, to an even more significant degree than usually the bigger countries. In this case, I would say like the United States and NATO, for example, are less affected by the deleterious effects than the global South, because usually they're the ones who target it with sanctions and sometimes outright war. And so the global South is looking at this, these countries are looking at this saying, oh, all of these things combined, why would we stick with you? This trend has only been accelerated by growing Chinese economic initiatives that have been fortifying Beijing's influence across the globe. So Prashad talks about how Chinese capital, whether it's public or private, is not a utopia, it's not salvation, but certainly not coming with the same kind of conditionalities that are imposed by the IMF. So far, the U.S. has yet to directly challenge BRICS, though a growing chorus in Washington has expressed alarm over calls for de-dollarization that could further limit the effectiveness of U.S. sanctions. In the face of this, Prashad said he hopes sober minds in Washington will prevail as the multipolar model advances. There may be a shift going on, and the U.S. might have to come to terms with that rather than contest the BRICS project, the new non-alignment project. So that's how the article ends. It's a decent article. Of course, there's some naivete there. I don't think that there will be cooler heads prevailing here. I think what we've seen all month, the whole month of June 2023, what have we seen? We have seen the United States attack BRICS countries directly. There's a strategy here. You have Modi visiting. Now you had South Africa be treated like dirt during that African Union mission. You've also had, they had an envoy spat, the U.S. envoy in South Africa, essentially lectured the South African polity, saying, "Why are you giving weapons to Russia?" Right? That happened, and that was very embarrassing. And of course, you have everything that's going on with Russia and China. You have Russia and China being targeted in this way. NATO at really an indirect conflict with Russia in Ukraine. And of course, you have the military encirclement happening to both countries and the increasing provocations against China with regard to Taiwan. And now there's more economic war coming to China with the possible investment ban by the Biden administration, piling onto, I should say, the export ban and the existing sanctions and blacklists on Chinese tech, the trade war to add in. There's a lot happening in this war on BRICS. And so the August summit is coming. There is not a lot of good coverage on it, but I think that article really does sum up the overall picture of where BRICS is going. So you have Bangladesh now expressing interest, and it is going to be interesting to see whether BRICS can formulate a true application process, absorb these countries, bring them into the fold. And once they are in the fold, not only will the GDP of BRICS countries rise well above, I think it's somewhere about 1 billion or maybe even less than that, bigger now in GDP terms. When I say 1 billion, it's a percentage above the US and Europe in GDP terms, the collective West, the G7 countries. Japan, I guess, is in the G7, but it wants to think of itself as a Western country, I think. But nonetheless, the G7 is now supplanted by BRICS by about a single percentage point, and that's set to just explode if countries like Iran, Algeria, all of these countries, Saudi Arabia, if they're allowed to join BRICS, then BRICS will be far larger. And we have to expect a pretty heavy-handed response from the United States. I don't think that this kind of underestimation of BRICS will last very long once it becomes a bigger entity. And so it's going to be a very exciting development. But I do think that there is caution being heeded by BRICS countries. I do think that you're going to see a lot of attempts to diplomatically negotiate what BRICS will mean as a political entity in order to avoid or attempt to avoid problems with the collective West. And now I don't think that they can be avoided. I don't think they will be avoided. And I do think the way the expression that they're going to take, this backlash to BRICS, is going to be, number one, it's going to be on Russia and China. And number two, it's going to take the form in increasing reprimands of global South countries that decide to join. So we should expect more sanctions. And I think those sanctions will probably target those countries already sanctioned, because it would look pretty bad for the United States to just start slapping sanctions on random countries that are actually politically and economically aligned with the U.S. in many ways, cooperative. However, we can't also rule out a Myanmar kind of model, this model of funding color revolutions and then supporting sanctions on those governments regardless of whether they were close in the past or not, or even close in the present. We can't rule that out, especially with regard to the Central Asian countries, because you remember, just before the Ukraine conflict jumped off, you had Kazakhstan, and I believe Kazakhstan will become a BRICS member. I believe all those Central Asian countries will apply to join at some point, especially Kazakhstan. But you remember in 2022, Kazakhstan was subject to color revolutionary activity that was funded and supported by the collective West. And it was a direct aim at Russia and China. And so we can't rule out more of that happening, attempts to drive bigger wedges between China and India. But I think the main impetus and focus will be on this policy of containment with Russia and China, hoping to strangle BRICS or cut off BRICS at the head. It's not going to work. These countries, China, Russia, they're just not to be deterred. I mean, they're not going to be deterred by bullying. It's not going to work. And whether it's Scott Ritter from his opinion, going to Russia, seeing what Russia was really like and saying, this is an incredibly strong country right now, whether it's that or whether it's my own observations from going to China, and I'll be back there for more observations soon. And of course, all of the friends of the show who've been to China, who live in China, that you've seen on this channel, they all say the same thing, that China's economy is not going to be arrested by this bullying. China is not going to be arrested. It's not going to decline, no matter how much they try to say it's at peak growth or China's reached its peak. No, it hasn't. I mean, global economic conditions are not great. Certainly, there are many challenges for China's economic growth in this period, externally and internally. But the general trend remains that China's economy will continue to grow at whatever pace it does. And the US and Europe are seeing their share of global GDP decline. And Europe, the acceleration is even worse because of what's happened with the Ukraine conflict, because of the sanctions that they've levied on Russia, but really on themselves. And we've seen a huge shrink in Europe's influence because of that. But it was already happening. It was already happening because many European countries have been following an American model, following the US down, whatever path it wants to go on, including in economics. And I was just there. I was there for 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks. And I got to say, the evidence is everywhere, from increases in homelessness to, you can tell, dilapidated infrastructure, a lack of public infrastructure for basic things like cleaning. So a lot of cities, despite their reputation as being clean, getting dirtier. And then public transportation and infrastructure like that getting more expensive, less reliable. And, of course, I'm not one to talk being in the United States. We have no reliable transportation. But at the same time, you also see the wreckage of inflation. Many European countries are not big economies. Western European countries, sure, they're bigger, and maybe median wages are higher. But when you go to countries like Czech Republic, for example, and you see the prices that exist there because of inflation, because of the way the EU has targeted Russia and other ridiculous policies pursued with the U.S. Agenda in mind, you just see just how much suffering really is being caused. When you're going to places like I was in Prague, you go there and you see prices, not just in tourism areas, but everywhere. Prices well above New York City for basic items. You are looking at a disaster for people in that country, because guess what? Living standards in Czech Republic are just nowhere near where they are in the United States. And this isn't to talk up the United States because of how much poverty there really is and inequality. But in terms of just dollar for dollar, right? Dollar to Czech crown, you're not, there's just no contest. And so that's the damage that these wars that the US is waging, that NATO is waging, is causing. It's causing a real decline. And BRICS is supplanting this process. BRICS is winning. BRICS is going to have a great summit, and we're going to cover it here, in August. And I look forward to covering it as progress on application, on currency, etc., develops. So stay tuned for that as the time approaches. With that said, everyone, that's it for the content. That's it. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to head out. Do some I got to do some preparations, and someone saw the fly by. That's hilarious. Yeah, that's annoying. It's hot right now in New York, and they always somehow find a way to get in. I hate flies, and my dog is definitely scared of flies. It's ridiculous. So if he sees one fly near him, he gets, he moves and disrupted, can't sleep. I don't blame him, but it's kind of hilarious. So, oh God, I gotta. They're hard to kill too. They're just hard to kill. Like these flies out in the city, they're something else. In any event, people making hilarious comments. In any event, I'm gonna end the stream now. Good to be with all of you. Make sure you like the stream before you leave. Hit the notification bell, subscribe button, and do support this channel. Patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong, monthly, annual subscriptions available. There's a lot of good stuff you can do and get through that venue. Substack is a great place to be sure also to consider YouTube membership if you like YouTube. That interface, $4.99 per month. One-time options in the link tree in the description in the channel banner. And last but not least, go to the link tree in the channel banner, subscribe to my Telegram, where you can get free notifications. And you can also I also do social media on there, much more than I do Twitter these days. So go to Telegram, t.me/DannyDhaiphong. The link is in my link tree as well. And with that said, I think that's all. Also, Substack for free. It's a newsletter. So you don't necessarily have to do an annual subscription or a monthly subscription. But of course, it's always appreciated. You can do the free newsletter. You get most of the features, most of the content, although my writing, all the posts become archived. So you'll get it as they come along, essentially. And you can get the notifications for streams there. So that is all. I want to wish you all a great rest of your day, great rest of your week. I will not be streaming until the week. It'll be the week of July 10th. Well, I get back the 11th. It'll be somewhere in that week. We'll have to see how my jet lag does when I get back. But do pay attention. The clips are coming, and do pay attention also to the potential for streams. They might happen impromptu. I don't know how much time I'll have to prepare them and all that, but do pay attention to streams. Videos coming out from China should be great. All right, everyone, take good care. Have a great rest of your day, and bye-bye.